Right. Hello, everyone. Apologies for the delay. We're getting the technical issues out of the way at the beginning, so we can continue without any. Welcome to everyone to the Sport for Social Change Alliance webinar, titled A New Alliance, Future Directions in Sport and Social Change. My name's Daniel Cade. I've worked as a consultant in the sport and sustainability industry for some time, and recently established my own consultancy called Responsible Sport. I'm here to introduce the webinar and to bring things to a close at the end. So the webinar serves two main purposes. Firstly, to officially announce the establishment of the Alliance, and secondly, and perhaps mainly, to provide a platform for discussion and debate to highlight and learn more about some of the most important issues in sport and society today. I'm first going to speak very briefly about that first purpose, and then we'll dive off into the first session on health inequalities. So what is the Sport and Social Change Alliance? Well, it's a group of 8 founding partners, some of whom are represented today by the moderators in each of the sessions, that come together as experts in their respective fields after extensive work together with football governing bodies, clubs, and brands. We know the power that sport has to create real social change, and the organizers represented within the Alliance work as independent organizations, but we have an MOU that sees us come together as a single entity to harness our experiences in sport and social change. The Alliance provides us with a framework to give voice to the common aspiration of a sport industry that can be at the heart of social, environmental, and economic change. And in our role as experts on specific issues, from the intersection of health and sport, to stakeholder involvement and governance reform, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and much more, the Sport and Social Change Alliance drives for positive impact and responsibility in sport. So what is our purpose? Well, as many have observed, and as the pandemic has worn on, it began highlighting and worsening the impact of many of our areas of work on society. It exposed the frailties of the sport industry and severely affected organizations working in the sector. So we've come together to lead the discussion on the value and function of sport in society, to offer support on how sport can be harnessed as a driver for social change, and to link debates to issues such as climate action, calling on the sector to act responsibly across the environmental, social, and governance domains. Our purpose is to represent all of those who are affected by the issues we seek to address, to work with organizations and individuals, sports bodies, brands, athletes, fans, governments at all levels who want to use sport to create positive impact, to make the case for the value and role of sport in society, to address the sector by putting forward suggestions for principles and actions for social change, and finally, to sensitize stakeholders towards the importance of addressing issues in collaboration. And that's what today's webinar is about, and indeed future webinars that we intend to hold. We set out to support sport organizations in their efforts by providing a deeper insight into an understanding of the issues that currently exist, how individuals and groups are being affected by them, and how they can be or are being addressed through sport. So before we go on to our first session, some brief housekeeping. Your participation as attendees is encouraged via the chat function. So please keep the chat focused on the discussions if you can. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please type it into the chat and I'll do my best to feed it into our moderators. Add your name if you'd like to, if it's not already obvious by your Zoom ID. And also, if you have a question that wasn't answered by the end of the session, just send us an email afterwards. The email address is info@sportchangealliance.com, Sport Change Alliance, one word. And we'll gladly answer it or forward it on to the speaker as necessary. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards. And captions, as you probably can see, in case they're needed, are provided below. So with only a 2-minute delay, we're now head over to our first session, which has the title, Does Sport Make Health Inequalities Better or Worse? And for that, I'm very happy to hand you over to our moderator, Matthew Philpott from Healthy Stadia.
Thanks very much, Daniel. That's absolutely fabulous. I'm slightly concerned that one of our two speakers doesn't seem to have been able to join the call. So I may have to flick things around a little bit. So apologies for that in advance. I'll just put that onto full screen. Hopefully people can see this. So what we're going to talk about today is health inequalities, not just what are they, but how can sport affect them positively, also how sport is potentially exacerbating them as well. And we're going to hear from two guest speakers, but a bit about Healthy Stadia. So we're a not-for-profit background, we're a not-for-profit organisation working across the field of sport, stadium operations, and perhaps most pertinently, public health. We now have established partnerships with large and small public health agencies and sports federations. So, for example, with WHO and UEFA, but also local grassroots organisations. What are we trying to do? Well, our primary objective is using sport to address lifestyle risk factors. So smoking, overconsumption of alcohol, poor diet, physical inactivity, all of which contribute to what we would refer to as non-communicable diseases. So these are the big chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancers, and mental ill health. Now, I don't think it's really breaking news that lifestyle risk factors are associated with these chronic diseases. But what we also try to look at is this secondary objective, and that's to intervene on growing levels of health inequalities. And that's by addressing what we refer to as wider determinants of health. And that's what we're going to look at in a bit more detail today. We're going to look at social determinants and also commercial determinants of health and how these impact on sport. So we're talking about the causes of the causes here. So we're talking about employment and fair wages, transport systems, access to healthcare or access to education, and also marketing of unhealthy products through sport. This is some of the areas that we work in as an organisation. So stadium-based policies such as tobacco-free policies at stadia, of which many in Europe still operate smoking allowed. Community and fan health interventions. So, for example, this fan weight loss program called Eurofit that we've been involved in delivering, and also campaigning. So, for example, challenging junk food and gambling marketing through sport. And we'll hear much more about that from our guest speaker, Robin, in a moment. So, just turning to health inequalities. Health inequalities, the definition we can give is that they are the unjust and unavoidable differences in the status of people's health across populations and between specific population groups. So we're talking about life expectancy, how long people live, and the quality of life they have during that lifespan. But this is about something which is unjust and avoidable. So essentially, this is a social justice issue. Let's look at this diagram here, this bubble diagram, where we can see some of the socioeconomic drivers of health inequalities. So in the red bubble in England, the range in life expectancy at birth between the least and the most deprived areas was 9.3 years for males and 7.5 years for females. So just purely by where you're actually born has a huge influence on how long that person will live. So how just is it that somebody who is born, say, for example, in Newcastle upon Tyne, will probably live a lot fewer years than somebody who is born in Greater London? There are a wide range of determinants that influence higher levels of health inequality. So we can see these in the diagram. These are factors concerning equality and diversity, geography, inclusion, health, and vulnerable groups. And of course, there is then an intersectionality of all of these different factors that we need to focus on as well. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed and, in fact, in many cases, exacerbated deeply rooted levels of health inequalities across all countries, certainly within Europe. And just a quick example, going back to deprivation again, of how this is cashed out. So if you look at the bottom axis, we can look at in the right-hand side, we can see the least deprived areas in terms of young people between the age of 10 to 11 who are classified as being obese. They're only 11.5%. and then we draw it back up to the most deprived areas on the left-hand side of the axis, and that's over doubled to 25% in areas of the most deprivation. So we're going to hear from two speakers in this session. We're going to hear first from Michael Saller, I hope at least, who is going to give us an overview of how his organisation, Everton in the Community, are addressing social determinants of health through their health programmes. And then we're going to hear from Robin Ireland, who's going to talk to us about the commercial determinants of health within sport. So Mike, if you are on the call, could you potentially take over now on the slides, or just say next slide? Are you with us for a start? Okay, it would appear not. I know that obviously there's been some people who have had problems joining the call. With that in mind, Robin, perhaps you can go first. It's not what we were intending, because we were trying to set this up with social determinants first, but perhaps if I fast forward through the slides to your presentation, perhaps we can just do this in reverse. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, that's fine. You can hear me okay, I assume?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Jolly good. Yes, I was about to say, Mike, and hopefully Mike will join us shortly. We'll give some excellent examples of how the badge of the club can be an excellent way to promote health. But of course, it's also a way perhaps of unfortunately being used to promote ill health. So yes. Mike's just joined us.
Mike's just okay, all right. Michael,
shall I continue, or do you want us to switch around?
Let's flip around, because I think it's much better if we have those social determinants.
Sure, yeah, that's fine.
All right, okay, Michael, I believe you're with us. Is that correct?
I am. Apologies for joining late.
Yeah, no, we've had some technical problems, so absolutely no problem at all. Okay, we were going to do it in reverse, so Robin was going to do his slides first, but let's backtrack here. And I've just given a brief overview of health inequalities and social determinants, Michael. So essentially, to help take us through that narrative, it's over to you. I think you should control the slides. If not, then just tell me next slide and I'll continue. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Matthew. And yeah, great to be involved today with the launch of this new alliance, and thank you for the opportunity. For the next 15 minutes, I'll talk you through the work of Everton in the Community with a particular lens on how we help to tackle health inequalities. And it's great that you've set the scene there, Matthew, in terms of the challenges we've had across the country, and you highlight some of the real differences between life expectancy in different parts of the country. I'll just see if I can move these slides forward.
Perhaps I'll do it, Michael.
Okay.
Just give me next slide when you need.
Yeah, next slide, please, Matthew. Yeah, so as I say, the next 15 minutes, I'll talk you through the work of Everton in the Community. Essentially, we are the official charity of Everton Football Club. We were launched in 1988, so this year is our 34th year. We're delivering a whole range of different social programs to help improve the outcomes of some of the most at-risk population groups across our communities. The next slide, please, Matthew. This gives a general overview of the organisation. So you can see here we deliver provision at almost 150 different locations. And the idea behind that is that we can position ourselves in the heart of as many communities as possible to help reach more people who are at risk of poor health and premature mortality. And we'll decide which locations we deliver based around the deprivation and the health outcomes within each area. So it is really taking that real kind of focus around tackling health inequalities and proportionate universalism. We have 130 staff working for the organisation, and they help to deliver over 40 different projects. At the moment, we have 48 different projects. Each project is supporting a different population group, and this operates across the entire life course. And each year we'll reach tens of thousands of people to help improve their health outcomes. The next slide, please, Matthew. So as Matthew kind of set the context in terms of the challenges that we have with regards to health inequalities. In the past, we used to make comparisons between different parts of Liverpool and in the south, in London, for example. We used to compare an area called Kensington in Liverpool and Kensington in London and talk about how the difference in life expectancy was around 10 years. What we can also do now, unfortunately, is compare the actual difference locally. So even within the city of Liverpool, you can see here the real stark difference with deprivation, but also there's a strong correlation between deprivation and poor health outcomes. The most stark way of looking at health inequalities is around life expectancy. And where we're located primarily in that Everton area in the north of the city, if we move around 8 miles south of the city, there can be a difference in life expectancy of around 8 to 9 years. So it's quite staggering in such a short distance, the real difference in life expectancy. But what also comes with that is the poorer quality of life as well that people live during those reduced years. The next slide, please, Matthew. So what we're doing as an organisation to help tackle these health inequalities is deliver what we call life course provision from cradle to grave across these 3 main areas: long-term health conditions, mental health conditions, and also age-related conditions. The next slide, please, Matthew. In terms of that life course provision, this is ensuring that we are as accessible to everyone as much as possible, regardless of age. We have a dedicated coordinator for each of these 3 areas here: starting well, living well, and aging well. And that falls into the wider policy area around those different age groups, as well having a real focus on how we can best improve outcomes for individuals and help to modify various risk factors across that life course. With regards to starting well, we do start very early. We have an antenatal and postnatal project, which is supporting the actual unborn baby, but also the mothers and the fathers. At the opposite end of the continuum, we have a range of older adult provision, and that includes passing the memory, supporting people living with dementia, Stand Together, supporting people who have been referred to us from their GP because they've been identified as being socially isolated. And across this whole continuum, it's a very extensive range of projects that we offer. As I mentioned before, 48 projects in total, supporting different population groups with different needs. This life course provision also allows us to identify key transition points across this life course where people may be at increased risk. So, for example, with children and young people, that transition from primary school to secondary school, and also with older adults, that transition from employment into retirement, where people can find themselves becoming more and more isolated. The next slide, please, Matthew. This just gives a quick summary of the approach that we take. So we will help to identify people at risk of poor health or experiencing poor health. And this will be through a number of different ways, through the reach of the brand of the football club, through our 130 staff, our 200 volunteers going out, a range of different partners that we work closely with, and also through self-referral or referral from different organisations. I gave the example before of GP referrals too. And once people come onto the project, they can, if they want, receive support via our layer of professional support. So, for example, we have an Everton in the community GP, so he can provide that support. If that's not required, if it's more social need, then they can join one of our many projects with a selection here, depending on age. And the individual could stay involved with that project for as long as they feel it's of benefit. And we have a number of people who've been through projects and remained with projects for a number of years to help with regards to, and they also provide a different aspect then as well in terms of that lived experience elements. And at the end of this continuum, the real focus is then on improving health outcomes and improving the quality of life. The next slide, please, Matthew. I spoke earlier about the focus around mental health, and this is a real issue for ourselves with regards to promoting good mental health and also with providing support around suicide prevention. Later this year, we'll be opening the doors of our latest capital project, which is called the People's Place. And this is a purpose-built mental health hub. The next slide, please, Matthew. This just gives you a summary of what the hub will provide, a purpose-built facility providing an overarching service to anyone regardless of age, gender, location, real focus on promoting positive mental health and suicide prevention. It will be the first of its kind associated with the Premier League Football Club. The next slide, please, Matthew. This slide here is being put together by our partners, Edge Hill University, we have a PhD researcher involved with this piece of work, helping to identify the real areas of need with regards to what the risk factors are for poor mental health, what the risk factors are for suicide, and building this together to make sure that we provide a real holistic package of provision divided into these 4 different areas here. Underpinning all of this will be that clinical support through our own GP and our GP team. So it's important that we can provide that medical support, but also importantly within a community setting, which is very informal and very accessible. Next slide, please, Matthew. This is what it will look like from the street view. So previously, this was a piece of derelict land, a hotspot for antisocial behaviour. So just from that street view, it's a complete transformation for the area within the L4 postcode. But not just about that street view appeal, it's also about providing a very important resource, a very important asset that will support people with a number of functions and purposes. The next slide, please, Matthew. This is inside the building, so we want to make it sure it looked as luxury as possible, as inviting as possible, to help to improve the self-worth of people coming into the building, and just a lovely setting where people can have conversations and engage in various activities. Next slide, please. Yeah, so obviously one of the key areas about how we measure the impact of our work, and I touched upon the partnership we have with Edge Hill University just a moment ago. This is a decade-long partnership. It was created in 2013, and it has a real focus on community sport, health and well-being. Now, in addition to providing good quality, robust monitoring and evaluation, we also co-design and co-deliver projects with Edge Hill. The first children and young persons football-based mental health project was born out of this partnership, and just this year alone, we've secured 2 significant awards, one within the North Educate award space, and also just last week we won an award, very kind of in tune with today's conference with regards to tackling health inequalities, and this is in the research, innovation and clinical space. So it gives an idea of the importance of this project, and the partnership in general with Edge Hill has helped us to gain a lot of attention and traction from government as well. We've had the UK Health Select Committee come to visit us at Goodison Park to learn more about our work, and we were able to help inform their suicide prevention white paper. I'm involved in a lot of conversations at the moment with regards to the new Level Up white paper, and also a number of other committees with regards to community sport, health and well-being. The next slide, please, Matthew. I mentioned before how we're able to co-design and co-deliver projects in partnership with Edge Hill, and this has also been supported significantly by our GP. So in the image in the centre, this is our GP, and we also have a number of GP trainees who support him. And this has helped us to deliver a whole range of new projects. So, for example, supporting people with diabetes prevention, falls prevention. More recently, we're providing ADHD screening, suicide prevention for middle-aged men, and also another project we're launching very soon is physical activity and lifestyle support for people who had to shield during lockdown due to various clinically extremely vulnerable people who are clinically extremely vulnerable and have those various conditions, whether it's autoimmune disease conditions or anything which may have resulted in them having to shield, and we're now helping them to reintegrate back into the community. The next slide, please, Matthew. Another way of measuring our impact is with regards to social value. So earlier this year, we had another societal value exercise carried out, and this is what looks at these 7 different areas here. So what impact we're having, for example, with reducing crime, with improving health, improving well-being, employment, all of these important areas which help to improve the quality of life of an individual, help to improve economic benefits, help to tackle those inequalities that Matthew touched upon earlier on with regards to life expectancy, and also help in areas with regards to deprivation as well. So Everton and the community were subject to this evaluation earlier this year, and the next slide shows that for every £1 invested in Everton in the community, £29.86 is generated in societal value. So essentially the work that we do, we're able to multiply that investment by almost 30 times. The beauty of this is that moving forward, this is likely to increase significantly when Everton Football Club moves stadium. So the next slide just shows you the plans for the new stadiums. This will be called Bramley Moor Dock, which will be located on the waterfront. So Everton and the community will have a presence within that stadium and also in the locality. And then in terms of the current Goodison Park stadium that will be demolished and it'll be transformed to allow a huge expansion of the current Everton in the Community charity and the work that we do. On the site, there'll be a health zone, which will include a GP practice. It'll include a dental practice. There'll be a whole range of different third sector organisations within that space. And we've got a very strong partnership board, which has been meeting for the last 18 months, which include a number of NHS bodies to make sure that it's fully joined up, and what we will provide here will complement existing services. And this will help to then increase that societal value further. At this point, I'll wrap things up, but just to say thank you again for the opportunity to present today, and we'll hand over to Robin for the second time.
Robin, you might be able to control the slides, but if you can't, then... Okay.
I'll just say, just keep going.
That's fine.
That's easy.
Okay.
Mike, it's a pleasure to come after you. You're the good news and I'm the bad news, maybe, because I think you've talked incredibly eloquently in terms of how the club badge can be a positive force for health and improving health. I guess I'm scrolling back and looking at how, unfortunately, sport can also be used to promote ill health. So I'm going to very quickly speed through this. I probably got far too many slides, but I guess what I really want you all to think about in the time is, as well as being used in the way that Mike just talked about, sport can also be used to promote brands on behalf of some quite unhealthy partners, and that's really where I'm going. So next slide, please. So the commercial determinants of health, to a certain extent, Matthew already introduced this. It's how transnational companies, big companies, can use in this case sport, but basically through their marketing in particular, but also how they open up trade routes and so on, how they basically can encourage us to consume unhealthy brands and unhealthy products. And we know that the kind of marketing that they do through sport is effective. Next slide, please. And again, Matthew talked about this. How do you manage to sum up ill health and the impact of all this marketing of unhealthy stuff on us? Well, very hard, but I just wanted to put a slide just that there are so many of us living with overweight and obesity, and that isn't because we've suddenly all changed genetically. It's essentially the biggest single reason is the fact that we are having ultra processed food being promoted as every single opportunity, with a net effect that significant number of young children now going from primary to upper stage school are already living with overweight and obesity, with unfortunately knock-on effects on their health the next 20 to 30 years, and considerable health inequalities, as your slide showed, Matthew. Next one, please. We sometimes just underestimate how sport is used, and very quick images here. I think I'm obviously going to be political all the way through this. It'd be hard on me not to, but I think we can probably safely all agree how the 2018 World Cup was used. There's considerable arguments currently going on about sports washing. There's discussion about Qatar. There's discussion about Newcastle United ownership. If you look on the left, this isn't new. This is the 1936 Olympics, the first Olympics to be televised, a promotion basically of the Nazi regime in Germany at the time. And the beginning of television, of course, has given the huge value of sport that we now have. It's watched globally. The bottom left, how good is sport sometimes at creating that spectacle for people to take part and enjoy and get huge pleasure from, but also be used in perhaps sometimes much more sinister ways. The torch relay was only actually invented by the Nazis in 1936. It doesn't go back to any original Olympic tradition, and unfortunately nowadays it's just used to sell as Coca-Cola primarily. So next slide, please. Do we think enough basically about the consumption of junk food, alcohol, and gambling? Tobacco companies we're all familiar with, no doubt, or at least those of us of a certain age. Some of these pictures here go back to 1907, so it's not unusual. Those of us who are as old as me, that image on the right hand side, the Park Drive book of football, you could only actually get that by smoking considerable numbers of Park Drive, sending off your coupons, and you get a free book. Thank goodness the world has changed. Next slide, please. However, it's worth being aware that we've known about the health outcomes of smoking for a very, very long time. in 1962 in the UK, and cigarette advertising was actually banned on British television in 1965. And you think, well, hang on a moment, a lot of those images that you showed on the slide before were still being used. Absolutely, because sports sponsorship provided a very convenient way for tobacco companies to promote their brands without it actually being considered advertising. We see this now when there's discussion about banning the advertising of junk food to young people. Sports sponsorship is never considered within that, and yet of course it's so visible. Next slide, please. Now we find that excitement of sport that has always been there, that we all associate with ourselves, that excitement, that passion, it's being used to sell us things. And a great example, if anybody wants to look up the Coca-Cola Where Everyone Plays, that excitement of fans, that clip which they put together, it's a 90-second video, won awards, has been watched by millions of people. And it's just about selling us a sugary drink, basically, isn't it? Next slide, please. So the next few slides are just going to give you some quick examples before I talk about actually, I'm just going to try and get rid of I can see myself on the screen, which is very off-putting. Let me just see if I can change that. I can't see the whole picture. I don't know how I can do that. Yeah, sort of done that. Thanks. Sorry. So I'm going to give you some examples. Red Bull is a classic example. Remarkably, Red Bull has only been a product in the European market since 1987. It's a £1 billion industry. It's associated itself very strongly with sport. We know it with Formula One, but also with men's football. It's all about promotion and sponsorship of edgy sports through primarily young people. And people of my age would, frankly, I wouldn't touch a Red Bull if it went past me and it was free or whatever. But for a lot of young people, Gen Z, wherever we're going out, highly promoted, a caffeinated, sugary drink of absolutely no nutritional value whatsoever. Next slide, please. And huge link between alcohol and sport. It's interesting. Budweiser, which is sort of a very obvious brand. It's part of AB InBev. They've actually been involved with sports sponsorships in 1953. They've been an official beer sponsor of the World Cup, not throughout, but most of the way through since 1982. Very scarily, despite local national laws preventing the sale of alcohol in football stadiums in Brazil and Russia, FIFA and AB InBev pressurized the host countries for these laws not to be applied during the course of tournaments. And those laws were in place to protect people's health. So when it comes down to it, FIFA, whoever, or in some instances UEFA, simply overrule local laws in order to basically sell us all beer. And those companies are so good at promoting themselves. So the picture here shows a campaign during the last World Cup where you could buy a glass, you put it on the mat and it lights up. So what happens with that is we all get complicit with it. So we all post very excited pictures of ourselves drinking Budweiser with the image on it, making that association of fun. It's all a laugh. It's about selling us beer. Next slide, please. Cadbury, that local friendly brand, it's actually owned by Mondelez International, one of the very, very big multinationals, transnational corporations, originally Kraft Food. They've been involved with sponsorship quite a long time. They've been criticized all the way through at all sorts of different times. The picture on the left-hand side is of a chocolate bar, absolutely ridiculously large chocolate bar, which you can buy and of course consume, with Cadbury's linked with the English Premier League and now with 20 clubs it was actually last season. They also use ex-footballers to promote them. Again, they're promoting the idea of a sugary snack that we can eat all the time, not just as a treat. It's something that they want to be associated with football. Next slide, please. And gambling brands is obviously quite a major topic, not just in the UK, but other parts of Europe as well. Gambling brands have proliferated in English football in the last 15 years. As you can see with the image there of Burnley of a couple of seasons back, the script on that is not Western, it's Chinese. The brands often target Asian markets where gambling may be illegal, and we sometimes think about the impact of sport in our local communities. actually the Premier League, the biggest audience for the Premier League is probably in Asia, measured by numbers of population, where it's absolutely enormous. And of course, along with football, in recent times, the use of digital technology and mobile phones in particular have made gambling so accessible. So you can watch your game on one screen and you can be betting on the other. Really no controls over this, and become completely normalized, raised lots of public health concerns at the moment. It's estimated one person per day is taking their life due to concerns around gambling, literally taking their life. It's shocking and very upsetting. Next slide, please. And the target of this marketing is often children and young people. That's actually a picture from Australia, where a few years back, cricket there was sponsored by Milo, which is a sugary chocolate drink. And let's not forget, still the biggest audience of sport is often young people, and often young men in particular, who are targeted by companies as having disposable income. Next slide, please. So this is a complicated slide. I haven't got too long, but I will leave it up a little bit, because let's just frame how discussion is generally placed in terms of the consumption that I've talked about. Well, you know, isn't a chocolate bar, occasional chocolate bar is fun, isn't it? There's no problem marketing alcohol, is it? It's just a behavior minority unwilling to curb their consumption. Policy solutions are all about educating us about self-regulation. We can trust companies to do that. We don't want heavy-handed regulations, do we? It's better for sport to do it. It's nothing to do with government, is it? And how would sport survive without commercial marketing? Well, let me flip that. That unhealthy consumption comes at a huge price in terms of our health. And I'm not saying that it's not possible to gamble occasionally. It's perfectly okay to have a pint every now and then. And no doubt I have chocolate every now and then as well. It's the promotion and the marketing of it through sport and how it drives it that I'm really concerned about. Sport is part of society, as we'll find throughout today. It's not somehow separate. So if industry isn't regulating itself, if sport isn't doing that, well, surely government should. And sport survived when tobacco company was taken away. It was all over the place back in the 1980s. We don't have it now, thank goodness. That took an international solution, incidentally, not done by government, our government. It was done by the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the World Health Organization. Next slide, please. Sorry, slight delay. You all right, Matthew? Thanks. Michael Duggar, this is the debate now coming around gambling, and the Gambling Act is being reviewed. This is the chair of the Betting and Gaming Council. And this is the kind of language that is now being used when people in public health like myself, who want to raise issues around health, around gambling, or I'm talking about alcohol, I'm talking about junk food, I'm talking about energy drinks. It is vital the industry's contribution to sports, local communities, jobs and tax revenues is not put at risk in the gambling white paper. And look at this loaded language with well-meaning but naive changes to regulation. Leave it to industry, we know best. Anti-gambling campaigners, they want to see a smaller regulated industry, but that would be bad news for the economy and exchequer. Never mind the knock-on effect and the misery that gambling has caused. Now, the kind of language that's being used now to oppose more regulation within gambling is exactly the same as used around tobacco control. So how much was the sale of tobacco contribute to the economy? Querying the evidence about marketing, tobacco industry arguing that they were developing safer products, exactly as the gambling industry said that tighter controls would lead to an increase in illegal cigarettes. They called out anti-tobacco campaigners, were called Puritans apparently for querying this, and used the language of personal responsibility to deny that government has a role to regulate. It's always our fault, isn't it? It's not the marketing to us to consume more. Next slide, please. I've only got a minute or two left, so just an example really of where there have been some challenges, and with a different sport, cricket, the 100, again, completely created for television, completely created to try and bring in a new audience and bring in more women, family friendly. And what was it marketing around? Junk food, snack food, unfortunately. And there were complaints made by the organisations at the bottom of that slide to the Advertising and Standards Authority. And it was found they were in breach of advertising codes in promoting direct to children on 2 counts there. Next slide, please. Running out of time. So I strongly believe that children's participation in sport is protected from unhealthy sponsorship. There are alternatives. Surely we all love our sport. should it allow itself to be associated with all things unhealthy? There needs to be more dialogue about marketing sport. There is rarely an opportunity to raise this kind of issue. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity today. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, I haven't got time to talk through everything on this image, but we've got the Women's Euros coming up. The gradual commodification of women's sport generally mirrors exactly the same as men's sport, exactly the same sort of partners coming in, unfortunately, in my view. Next slide, please. And I've got one or two examples there, both unhealthy and healthy. That's way back in the 90s, the gentleman with the wonderful tash sporting a give up smoking sign. A little bit more recent, in fact, last season, that's Hartin Melodian front of their shirt supporting muscular neuron disease research in Scotland in a partnership with Dell Technologies. Much less positive, unfortunately. In fact, Matthew had a slide in McDonald's support for junior football in the United Kingdom. That's a picture from Northern Ireland. I'd like to see less of this. Next slide, please. That's it. Thanks ever so much for the time. That's my email if anybody wants to follow up on any of this, and that's my Twitter. Really grateful for the discussion. Cheers.
Robin, thanks very much. And Mike, thanks hugely to yourselves. We started a tiny bit late. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm not going to be able to field any questions from the floor, but I'm just going to basically ask Mike and Robin just 2 very quick questions if you might want to come back on this. Mike, thanks so much for your presentation. I think what was really interesting about that was the relationship that you have with an academic partner and how that has galvanized a lot of your work around health inequalities and working on the social determinants of health. How can other sports organizations think about working with academic partners, and what sort of points can you bring in terms of kind of a few pieces of advice around how they can set that up?
Yeah, it's been a very, very beneficial partnership for ourselves. As I say, it was started in 2013. Next year, it'll be 10 years. It's helped us in a number of ways. One of the real areas that we want to kind of expand on is how we demonstrate the impact that we deliver, and that's how EdGL can support with that in terms of monitoring and evaluation, but also bring on a lot more to that partnership too. So I mentioned before how they help to co-design and co-deliver projects, and having that research angle helps make sure things are evidence-based. So the biggest capital project for ourselves at the moment is the People's Place, the mental health hub. And as I mentioned, we have a PhD researcher fully embedded within that project. We're carrying out a lot of consultation work with the third sector, with various NHS bodies, and EdGL at the heart of that. And then that will continue in terms of once the project is up and running and people are accessing that support, that'll be tracked and monitored, and then we'll have a number of evaluations to come out on the back of that in different areas. It's also been important for securing funding as well. We secured a number of grants through some grants that we are eligible for, some grants that EdGL are eligible for, whether it's like the charity sector within academia. So that's been very important too. But what we're finding now is a lot of funding streams that we do explore, they do actually ask for that external verification and that external input from academia. So it's that kind of that change has moved already, and I think that will only continue to make sure that we can best evidence the work that we do. Yeah. In terms of how organisations can get involved, it's certainly just linking in with maybe your local university, or looking at what universities specialise in with regards to what your real kind of portfolio is with regards to. So a lot of the work we do is around tackling health inequalities. EdGL have a very strong department within that space, so that it's worked very well for ourselves. But yeah, certainly explore that, and it's very much a win-win situation. We gain a lot of benefit, but also EdGL in terms of increased exposure, improved student experience, and also income generation as well. So it is very much reciprocated, and something that I very much encourage.
Thanks, Michael. That's fantastic. And Robin, just very quickly, perhaps in a minute, just a minute, Are there any practical steps that you might suggest? I mean, clearly this is about balance in terms of implementing this. Yeah, we do need to see change, and we need to see it quite quickly, actually. In particular, some of those areas you discussed around, say, gambling, but also junk food as well. But, you know, that balance of commercial interests and health outcomes, you know, what practical steps do you think you could advise in terms of not just governments, but also governing bodies of sport and clubs in terms of perhaps taking more of an ethical approach to the type of sponsorship and marketing that they opt into?
I think it's quite early days, and I think we're sort of raising the question. What you see in one or two clubs is supporters very strongly challenging different types of sponsorship. So I can say that my own club, I supported Norwich City and have for many years. They were very much challenged when they took on a gambling sponsor last year, and the real, I suppose, the response of supporters meant they actually dropped it. So we sometimes have a bit more power than we think we have to challenge the type of sponsorship that comes through. And I think we really should be asking at all levels, whether as parents or as fans, over whether different types of sponsorship are appropriate. It's not an easy question, but I think those of us who worked in public health a long time, like myself, get very frustrated when the argument is always put as very binary: economic well-being on one side and health and well-being in the other. So the income that comes in one side sometimes has very negative impacts on our health. We should be discussing them at the same time, not separating them.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. And I'm going to hand over now to Piara Power, who is Executive Director of FARE. And Piara, on with your session on refugees and how sport can really support refugees in terms of the current crisis. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks very much. Thank you to that. Thank you for that amazing session, actually. I think that gives us a clear insight into a lot of things that are happening around sponsorship and sport and the dangers of that, and how we all need to be aware of that and campaign to try to clean up sport from the unhealthy eating habits that have been established. Now, this next session is about the issue of refugees in sport and effectively how refugees can effectively be supported by sport as an ecosystem, how we can contribute to the integration of refugees, how we can make sure that we can, as a sporting infrastructure, contribute to the ongoing crisis. I'm going to introduce very quickly, in no particular order. You can see already, I think, my friend and colleague Sasha Fomenchov, who is from the League of Tolerance in Ukraine. I'm also going to be joined by Nick Saw from UNHCR. And I think we're also going to have Julianne from Champions Ohne Grenzen. I'm going to start with Nick to get an overview of the UNHCR's position on refugees and the intersection with sport and how sport can contribute to the settlement of refugees. Then I'm going to talk to Julianne, because she may have to leave just before the end, and then talk to Sasha about his personal experiences as a refugee, as a displaced person from Ukraine. So over to you, Nick, and just to remind people who don't know you, you lead the team at the UNHCR, which deals with sport and and sport actors in the ecosystem or potentially in the ecosystem. And I think you're going to hopefully start by giving us an overview of what we are quite rightly now terming as the sort of refugee crisis ongoing in the world, the numbers of refugees that there are, the patterns of settlement, and why we're seeing so many, and then we can move on into a conversation.
Thanks a lot, Piara. And thank you to you and Daniel and the team at the Sport and Social Alliance, Social Change Alliance, for the invitation to speak this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen. Apologies for not sending slides in advance. Hopefully my technophobia won't get the better of me, and you'll be able to see the presentation that I have. Can you give me a thumbs up, Piara, if you can see? Okay, super. So the the first slide that I want to show is really a slide that tells a very clear picture of a deteriorating situation globally over the last 10 years. In 2012, there were less than 50 million people who had been forced to flee their homes as a result of conflict, violence, persecution. And 10 years down the line in 2022, and we've all seen the situation in Ukraine over the last few months, we've hit 100 million people globally, which is quite astounding. That's 1 in 78 people on the planet. So next time you go to the shopping mall or you go to a bar or a restaurant, you look around you and you can see that in that room there are people represented who have been forced to flee as a result of conflict, violence, persecution, and so on. So this picture is something that is as Piera has outlined, is a global problem. And of course, top of everybody's mind is the Ukraine situation, because it's a situation that is ongoing. It's a European situation, and it's very very high profile at the moment. But last year we saw a situation in Afghanistan as the Taliban came back into Kabul and overran the government there. And UNHCR has been supporting refugees from Afghanistan for 40 years, as have the states around Afghanistan. We have Yemen, often described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and millions of people affected by the situation in Yemen. In the last couple of years, we've also had a refugee and an internal displacement situation in Ethiopia, which is ongoing. We see ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course, a country that in 2011, 2012, 2013 was, and 2015 in particular in Europe, was the top of everybody's list of refugee countries, but Syria, which is now, we don't hear about the situation in Syria anymore, but there are still millions of Syrians who are refugees and haven't been able to return home because of ongoing insecurity. So I think that what we've seen since the end of February is a huge outpouring of support for people, the people of Ukraine and the Ukraine situation, and a huge amount of resources and goodwill that have been raised, and it's really put refugee issues at the top of the agenda again. But unfortunately, the news cycle is short, and whilst there is a huge amount of support for Ukraine at the moment, those other situations that I described, the Afghanistans, the Yemens, Ethiopias, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Venezuelans who've been displaced abroad, all of those situations have huge funding shortages, because resources are rightly enough being mobilized for Ukraine, but there isn't an endless supply of resources worldwide to support refugee situations. So I think that what we at UNHCR have been working to do over the last number of years is to implement the Global Compact on Refugees, which is a global agreement that was agreed by member states in UN member states of the General Assembly, and that outlines a way of a global way of supporting refugees, particularly in large flows. And one of the key tenets behind the Global Compact on Refugees is what we call a whole of society approach. And this really recognizes that humanitarian organizations such as UNHCR and others do not have the resources or the capacity to deal with, and at the time in 2019, it was 76 million displaced people globally, do not have the capacity or the resources to deal with the huge numbers of people who are being forced to flee. And so what we've done is we've tried to look to different sectors of society and to engage them as supporters for the refugee cause, but as humanitarian workers in their own rights. And I guess this then brings us on to the topic of what role can sport play? And I'm going to just switch over to the next slide. So I think that for UNHCR, when we talk about sport, Piara mentioned the sport ecosystem, and really this is how we view sport as a partner. Thinking about football governing bodies, the Olympic movement, national sport structures, and sport is quite special in many ways, that it has this architecture in every country around the world that exists through the Olympic movement, through football, through government ministries that can and does engage in activities for the host communities, but also for those who are hosted by those communities and governments. And so for UNHCR, when we think about how sport can engage, we think about it more broadly than just sport-based programming. Obviously, the sport-based programming is a key component, a key pillar, almost one could say, of the way that the sport ecosystem engages. Because I think all of us who work with sport believe that sport activities in themselves can inherently be good and be positive in the lives of young people, of children, of adults, and of older people. So that sport-based programming piece is key. But we also see that there are opportunities for young people and communities around elite sport, that we can communicate through sport and with sport, that there is opportunities for diplomacy and resource mobilization. And I'll just go into a little bit more detail. So sport activities, for example, and I was listening to the previous presenters who outlined quite clearly the role that sport can play and is playing in the programs that they are implementing. But sport can play a very positive role in people's physical and psychosocial well-being. It can play a key role in social inclusion, particularly of women and girls, young people and older people with disabilities, but also in social cohesion, and particularly in integration of and inclusion and integration of refugees and IDPs into communities. We also see that identifying young people with elite talent provides life opportunities that refugees are often unable to access through other means. And for those of you who don't know, in an awful lot of refugee hosting countries, refugees do not have the right to work. They do not have the right to an education necessarily, and so on. So their opportunities are limited. But sport is an area where often they can engage, and there are opportunities for pathways to new lives through education and jobs, through livelihood opportunities, and to represent refugees on the world stage. The third area that we see sport has a huge role in is communication, and the sport ecosystem has a voice and a reach that's almost unparalleled through the reach of football teams. I'm not going to name any particular teams, but the support and the fan bases that teams have is phenomenal, and far outstrips anything that UNHCR and humanitarian organizations to do. So the communication through and with sports organizations to give refugees a voice, to tell positive stories about refugee integration, about refugees, about the contributions that they make to the communities that host them. can help us to change the narrative about refugees. There's often quite toxic narrative about refugees stealing jobs, about refugees coming from bringing with them violence and so on. And it provides an opportunity to reach new audiences and to tell these positive stories. The fourth area that we see that sport has, that there's huge potential with sport, is that this area of sport diplomacy. So using sport as an enabler to introduce refugee issues into fora, into areas where refugee issues are not normally visible or present. And the way that, I mean, some ways that, you know, this can be done is through sporting goodwill ambassadors, sports people who are willing to take up the mantle and to talk about refugee issues. You can see on the left there, Alphonso Davies, a former refugee, Bayern Munich player and the UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador, and he is a very prominent voice for refugees and for UNHCR. Through mega sporting events, through partnerships with visible sport entities, and through the Global Compact on Refugees. And there is we do have quite a number of sport organizations that have signed up and pledged to support refugees through the Global Compact on Refugees. And if anybody is interested in pledging to support refugees through the Global Compact, then we can share more information on that. And so, or certainly PR or I could do that. And then the final area is resource mobilization. And there are different ways in which the sport ecosystem can support refugees through resource mobilization. The first is to support sport-based programming, either through funds or through expertise and other kinds of resources, whether those be in-kind resources like equipment, shoes, etc. The other area where the sport ecosystem can support is really in emergency situations through cash injections to humanitarian organizations, and we've seen this with the Ukraine situation. Huge generosity of the sport ecosystem to UNHCR and other humanitarian organizations who then use these funds directly to support refugees inside and outside of Ukraine. So beyond sport-based programming, which the other speakers will address much more eloquently than I will, there is huge potential for sport to support refugees and to have a real impact in their lives, and to tell positive stories, to paint a different picture of refugees. But it is sport as an activity that binds us together and provides opportunities to make friends in new communities, to build relationships, to create networks, and to settle, have fun, and try to restart lives. Thank you, Piara.
Thanks very much, Nick. That's a great overview. And I was just thinking it's a sort of presentation actually that a few years ago I or members of my team were giving. And so it's great to see that this is the focus inside UN Refugees, and you are taking this on at the highest level to sports governing bodies into the ecosystem. One question I've got for you very quickly is that on a day-to-day basis, how are you and the team working on these issues? What right now, for example, this would be a good snapshot. What are the challenges? What are the policy challenges that you're working on in regard to sport and refugees and the need for sport to play their part?
So I think very practically, Piara, so as you're aware, UNHCR has been facilitating a kind of coordination group around the Ukraine situation, and in 2015, 2016, there was huge support from sport across Europe for the Syria crisis. But perhaps a lack of joined upness in terms of thinking, and so after speaking to a number of organisations, including FAIR, we felt that UNHCR had a convening role to play around the Ukraine situation and offer a platform for sports organisations to come together and to share their thinking around how to respond as an ecosystem, as a society. So I think that this is one of the key areas that that we see that where UNHCR has added value as a humanitarian organization first and foremost that has expertise in refugee issues, and where we can support the sport ecosystem to be more effective. I think the other area that we struggle with a little bit, but is very important, is that humanitarian organizations and sport organizations speak a different language, so much of our work is really very much about trying to harmonize language and ways of working, so that when we do come together, we understand what each other are saying, and that there is a little bit more understanding in the sport ecosystem of how the humanitarian system works, and vice versa.
Amazing. Thanks very much for that, Nick. And just to top off that part of our discussion, I've seen Alphonso Davis's tweet on the eve of World Refugee Day, when he said that World Refugee Day is an important moment for me. Anyone can become a refugee at any moment. They deserve our support. #WithRefugees. And he got something like 3,000 likes and quite a lot of retweets from that. So I guess it illustrates your point. Here is the most high profile former refugee athlete. And I think it's important that we see people like him and others like him as a positive representation of the refugee community, the asylum seeking community, which generally we don't see a lot of positive news about. So, I think we all get it. The question is what we can do within our own settings. And I think for that, I'm going to turn to Julianne Schlinkenreider. I hope I've got your name correct, Julianne. You are from Champions Ohne Grenzen, who are based in Berlin and have been doing a lot of work, particularly with women and girls refugees, using football as a methodology. And I guess for us at FAIR, we really began to know your work in the post-2015 situation, when Germany opened up to Syrian refugees. But I'm sure everybody would be interested in knowing the full scope of your work, how you were set up, and what your focus is now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Piara, as well for the invitation. Thank you, Daniel. And thanks, Nick, for this good overview now for the background informations. So there we have these. Yeah, actually, I'm part of Champions Ohne Grenzen. We are a grassroots refugee sport community in Berlin. We do offer, some, especially football. So we do have football sessions, but also different sports sessions. So we do as well at the moment boxing and yoga. And actually, our program already started in 2012. Which is now with the background knowledge of what actually happened in 2015, 16. So you see that actually all this, the topic of refugees, the topic of asylum and people who have to flee their countries got so big inside of the media, and it got like, now it is here, and we saw like the attention got drawn totally towards it. But we as an organization, we started 3 years before that. So we could see on the numbers that Nick was showing with the UNHCR, it did not start in 2015. I think we have a lot of people fleeing over the world since the whole last time, and as well in 2012. And there were a lot of people already in Berlin. And we could see clearly that the structures, so those structures in the, let's say in the football clubs, in the sport clubs, they are not that open as we all wish they were. So we saw that in the sport clubs, actually people who are refugees, or maybe as well with migration background, but especially like arriving newly in Berlin, they were not included in the football clubs around here in Berlin. So in 2012, there were some friends of mine, they started with just an open training session. We just thought, okay, we take this 1.5 hour a week. We be here, we do a training, and everybody can come. We will not check if people have papers as well. So that at least as well people who don't have any papers and so have a possibility to take part in a training session, which is not the case at all in regular sport clubs. So it started as a mixed training in 2012. We had one female trainer and a male trainer. And it got like, in the first session, there were already some people who were also coming as refugees to Berlin, but they got directly into like as well the executive process, so to say, of our club of Champions Ohne Grenzen. They are now as well part of the board. They are the trainers now of us. So we are really like a program with refugees and not just for refugees. And but what was quite interesting as well, if we had a female trainer and a male trainer, the people coming to the football sessions were men. So it's cis men, and we actually really wanted to as well, to reach out to women, maybe to do some sports, to the football, but we saw actually football. I think we all know we are all doing stuff with sport and development, football for goods and all these kinds. But I think it is also always quite important to have in mind that football itself as a sport is a quite patriarchal one from its history, from what structures we face, and we still face in the professional sport especially, but also on this mainstream level, on the grassroots level. So it is still a sport which is maybe more difficult to enter for women, and then especially for refugee women who are facing like way different life realities. So 1 year after we started our mixed session, we are thinking of this has to be different. So we have to do a different session to really reach out for girls and women. So we started to doing a women's session. So to have a training session once a week, which is as well on a football pitch and outside. So we had one training outside, which is on a football pitch, and we were just women. So it was clear we have a safe space here. We have female trainers. We have then social workers as well who are playing with us, who are there to, people are coming up with some questions. But it was clear we have this space for us. We were trying to provide childcare at the same time, so that as well people who have children and have nobody who can take care of the children during this time, that they also have the possibility to come and do sports. And at the beginning, we were also trying to go to refugee shelters, for example, and to fetch the people up. So to go there, to having a look who's coming, and then going all together with the subway to the training, and also bringing them back again. So, which is of course important if you're completely new in a city, in a big city, and you don't understand maybe the transportation system. So that people would feel more eager to come with us and do the sports. And we were seeing in the first time, it was quite difficult until we really set up this women's football team. I think it took us nearly 2 to 3 years that we had really a stable group, that we had a group that we really could do training once a week, and there were enough people to play. It took a long time. And I think it is also part of it, of course, is I often hear from other football clubs that they are like, of course, yeah, we want to do a session for refugee women. We open this up, but nobody's coming. And then they stop again. So I really hear it often. And but I could also thinking it is a more difficult structure to enter, and also, but it is important to know the context, to understand the context of refugee women, in which situations they are facing as well at the moment, what can be a barrier to go to a training, to a sports training, what life situations they are facing. And for this, it is also important to understand, most of them didn't had any chance to play football before. So if you go somewhere and tell, hey, there's a football session for women, most of them will be like, okay, like football, isn't it like a man's sport? Never played it. Maybe I don't like it. So of course, it is something that is not directly as it was for the refugee men, as it was for our other trainings. Like we opened it up and there were directly 20 people playing. So
So that's really interesting, and I think it's a question that used to be asked, but I'm glad it's being asked less now, which is the sort of incredulity that people would have that you have to put on a separate session, and you do really, right, in order to attract particularly women and girls that have never played football before. You can't expect them just to turn up in a mixed session. You have to arrange transport, as you say. You have to market them specially. You have to give them reassurances of safety, all of those things. That's the foundation, right, of any targeted work with refugee women and girls in your view.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about other projects that you, are seeing as sort of compatriots in the cause around Europe? Are there other projects that you also see that are doing similar work and have cracked the ability to work directly with refugee women and girls?
I think over the last years, we've got to know some other project who was working, but there were special project formed for it. But I was seeing it still a lack in, let's say, traditional football clubs. So yeah, still a lack to focus on how to include especially refugee women.
And so we saw in the post-2015 period that the DFB and government-sponsored foundations in Germany put quite a lot of money into welcoming refugees. And your analysis of that would be that they need to do more with refugee women. How successful was that central funding drive to get people involved?
I think there was success you could see. So there were programs who reached out to girls and to women, but I think then often they left it, so to say. So they this one part, so from this going to an open training to really becoming part of a, let's say, of a regular team, to be regular in a team, to play in league, and like this step, I think, is something that is still missing a bit.
Right. Okay. So the continuum is the bit that needs to be more work done. One question I guess I would have now is, what's your future outlook? Germany is still host to many refugees. Many people are being, integration does not happen overnight. It takes a long time. Are you now sort of spreading your geographical focus for champions, or are you now also working with Ukrainians who are coming in, or spread it to other communities? What's the sort of focus from now?
Yeah, I think we still are, we as champions are still in Berlin based. I think it would be still great to get the knowledge over to other cities in Germany. And yeah, of course, now we also did some special training offers for families, where especially we want to give the opportunity to Ukrainian families to play football as well. And I think in the future, I think for us, our vision would be that, of course, that one day Champions Ohne Grenzen, there's no need for it anymore. So that one day, the sports clubs are so inclusive that actually our work is not that important anymore. But for the meantime, I think it's also quite good to have these sports sessions, but also to have more inclusion of refugees as well on all different phases. So also as the ones who work here, as the ones who create the spaces, and not just as the ones participating in it.
Yeah, I was struck actually by when you said that it's not just for refugees, but it's now also by refugees, right? And you want to do effectively sort of some power sharing with the community. Otherwise, it just becomes a top-down initiative that is not as connected as it could be. Thank you, Julianne, for that overview. That's really, really useful. I know you have another meeting to go to fairly soon. And if there's any questions, we can always follow up with you. Any specific queries, we can always redirect them to you. And thank you for the work that you've done in approaching 10 years now, and that Champions has done. And we wish you well. And we know actually that Champions are amazing. It's an amazing setup with amazing people, and the numbers of people that you're reaching in terms of your audience is phenomenal. So you really have contributed, I think, to changing the landscape in some way when it comes to refugee women and girls, and the methodologies that are being used across Europe and wider across the world. We know that for sure. So thank you for that work. I'm going to now introduce Alexander Fomichov, also known as Sasha, who is from the League of Tolerance. Now, Alexander has quite a story. His family was displaced in 2014 after the Russian attack in the Donbass region. He is Ukrainian, and they fled to Donetsk. That's where the League of Tolerance was formed as a means of creating social change through sport. And then again, sadly, recently, you can probably imagine, given the attacks on Donetsk and the Donetsk region, Sasha and his family have fled to Sweden. So I think so you're currently now on a break in Albania, I think, Sasha, but you are at the moment living in Sweden. Tell us a little bit about what's been happening recently in terms of your personal situation, your family situation, and then also how you've been able to continue to work.
Nice to meet you, friends, and I hope you hear me well, because I have some problems with the connection, but I hope that you will hear all my words. So now we came to Albania, and also it is good to have here friends from our fair network who hosted us, and we have a great honor to volunteer on the eco-social farm. I will tell the story not only about myself, but also about our work as coaches and educators in Ukraine, because I know that many of you now thinking about programs for refugees and you think how to develop something really fruitful for the integration, for socialization, and so on. So this is my background, and you can always contact me if you have any other ideas or initiatives which I could support or I could join with pleasure. So you know that if we speak about sport, you can always start from the identity, because people find something very, very internal in sport, you know, and if they had sport or if they haven't sport in their childhood, by the way, they need to find some kind of self-identity on the new place of living when they become refugees. And for this, you should know how it is a structure in Ukraine for grassroots sports, because mostly we work with grassroots sports. And even if you use only the more accessible soccer, like for European football, like it was popular in Ukraine, and you can also add some other sports as combination of trainings, as maybe some kind of things that could be familiar for kids from Ukraine, from young people, for young people from Ukraine. Then they will use this to be more and more sustainable on the new community, and play not only something new for them, but also something popular for them in the childhood, and something that they could use for their better self-expression. So this is the structure of grassroots sports in Ukraine. You can see that we have different levels, but common things that mostly people in Ukraine do sport one time per week, sometimes like 1 time per week, and very rare 1 time per 2-3 days. On our playgrounds, we use some kind of Scrum methodology. Maybe you know this from IT. For example, we have educational projects for 2 months, 3 months, when mixed teams from refugees. We had before internally displaced people. You know that if people moving inside the country. They call internet displaced people, and mixed teams of these people. They start to have trainings in their teams, and also every week develop something mutual, because it's very nice for identity, for creation of new, more wider self-identity when you make something together with new friends. And for example, it could be anthem for your team, it could be motto, it could be logo, it could be even design of the jersey. And every week, a different person responsible as a team leader, another person is a product owner. Also, we have people who are development team, and next week, for next task, they have new composition of the team. So everybody will be a leader, like in full size or lower. But by the way, it's not about only talented young people, it's about everybody, because decision making allows you to invite everybody. And now I will speak about my own way of integration, and also I want to share with you some kind of things that you could share. For example, in formal education for coaches and physical education teachers, because many of them don't know what to do with refugees. Maybe it is a gap of language skills, because I know that sport is universal language, but what to do if you have people who don't want to play, because you always need to propose the choice, like this sport or maybe another sport or maybe another joy and then sport. So this is very nice when youth workers, children workers on the place have this type of education. And then when you see them some kind of festivals, I don't like when it is like refugees welcome all the time, because sometimes you will have problems with communication inside some locality, because maybe they had some challenges with refugees before, and when they hear about new festival with name Refugees Welcome, they will say, oh, again, now we have Ukrainians, only problems, and so on. So when you have like some kind of just like open festival, and people could play some sports, could enjoy the food, and then understand, oh, now my son played with a girl from Ukraine. Maybe now first time I ate Ukrainian borscht or other food, so I start to be much more polite to the people. I start to know them, I start to speak with them, because the most valuable thing now is communication. And also a very, very nice point if you have some kind of leadership programs, because it's helped me very well in 2014 when we moved for 1,000 kilometers from Donetsk to the Western Ukraine. And after one of the leadership programs for refugees, because I already start to do some activities there on the new place with orphans, I used my football skills from the previous life, and they invested some resources, some time to my education, So after that, we opened 3 football schools, invited top football clubs, and so on. So this is a full story, and you are always welcome to contact me, because like I'm this kind of strange people who always answer you in social media. So please don't hesitate to ask for any mutual work together.
Thank you, Sasha. I know you had a lot to get through there, just in terms of talking about the work that you do and your personal history. Just one question before we have to close the session. What message would you send as a Ukrainian whose country is under attack, and we're seeing millions of refugees from that country? What message would you send to Europe and the world right now?
Yeah, so now it's very, how to say, now we have a situation when people start to be boring about this war in Ukraine, So because in first months it was solidarity support, but people have Ukraine every day in the news. And I understand that of course, people have own like lives and they need to build careers and so on. So it's not possible to be volunteer for all your life if you, for example, volunteered for Ukrainians. But by the way, creating something that could be self-sustainable, you know, for example, when you see that you just need to have a one step forward, you know, and then people will make everything by their own, it's very crucial. And I also like this approach when like no matter how you play, what is matter is that you are on the playground, you know, that what is matter is that you are one of the players, you know, and this is very nice when you feel that you can be also useful for the community. For example, with this thing like common jersey, yeah, you received this jersey before the tournament, and in this moment you understand. So of course I had like 2 months of playing football, but it was not just playing football. Now I have something like some product which unite me with local people, you know, and for this they are helpful for me, and I also received new competences, new language skills, and so on, using this very, very like how to say, joyful work, because everybody was like heard, you know, all the voices were heard. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. If I understand you correctly, you're saying, please don't get tired of what's happening in Ukraine. Please keep watching, and the symbols of solidarity, of friendship, of unity are important. And we can bring those together on a football pitch. So keep doing those, swapping shirts, shaking hands, sharing food. Those are the things that remain important.
Yeah, give a chance to be useful, because sometimes we just say that, oh, what we could get from refugees, but yeah, you could people don't take only like challenges for you. People also take brain, like skills, values, and so on. So yeah, use this fully.
Yeah. Thank you, Sasha. I think on that we can end this session. It's been quite brief, but I think we've got a very good overview of the top line policy work that's going on and the leadership that the UN are giving through Nick Saw and his team. We've had a look at the difficult issues, although not difficult if you apply yourself, in terms of refugee women and their integration through our colleagues at Champions Honor Granson, and then some personal testimony there from Sasha from Ukraine, the League of Tolerance, and his views on what's happening with refugees. There's lots more to discuss, and I think there are more forums to do this. If you have any more queries, please then do email us in, and we can deal with those queries and direct you to the right direction. And the UN refugee website has a lot of information about this, and many of our websites, I think, around will have lots of information on the issue of refugees and their integration and how sport can play a role. I'm now going to hand over to Joanna Deagle of CAFE for the next session, which is what does women's sport need to do to become more inclusive? Over to you, Joanna.
Thanks very much, Pierre, and thanks to Nick, Julian and Sasha for that great session. It's obviously a topic that is only getting more and more important every day and really does touch the whole globe, as Nick said. I think Julian nicely led into our session when she spoke about the barriers that female refugees face in accessing opportunities to sports. So it's my pleasure to introduce session 3, which is what does women's sport need to do to become more inclusive? My name's Joanna. I'm the Managing Director of CAFE and Stiftung CAFE, which are part of the founding organisations of this Sport and Social Change Alliance. And CAFE exists to ensure that disabled people can enjoy, take part in and contribute to sport, whether that be as spectators, volunteers or employees. But we're not going to talk about that today. We'll talk about that in another webinar in the future. I'm really honoured to moderate this session with 2 incredible women who are leading and changing the landscape of sports, of women's sport. We've seen a huge growth in the women's game in terms of recognition, investment and interest. And the Women's Euro this summer in 2020 is expected to attract record viewing figures. Similarly, we've already seen in the space of 3 weeks, Barcelona women breaking the attendance record twice for a women's match at the Women's Champions League quarterfinal and semi-final, where at the semi-final they reached almost 92,000 spectators. And we're also seeing more and more national football teams offering equal pay to their men and women's team. And that can be a whole discussion in itself. But this session explores why we're seeing such a boom in certain aspects of women's football, how the landscape looks in other sports, how this has impacted grassroots initiatives and the industry in general, and how and why women's sports still needs to become more inclusive. So despite the positive visibility and outlook we're seeing at the moment, when we dig a bit deeper, we see that women are occupying only 3.6% of senior governance positions at elite level clubs, national leagues and UEFA, of which only 0.1% are ethnic minority women. The figures are even worse when we look at senior coaching positions, where not a single ethnic minority woman held one of the 672 senior coaching positions in elite men's and women's football across 7 countries in Europe. And that information came from FAIR, so thank you to that great research. Today, I'm joined by Gemma Fay, the former captain of the Scottish women's national football team. Gemma played in the previous Euro in 2017 in the Netherlands and has amassed a record-breaking 203 senior caps over a 19-year career. Now, as head of women's and girls strategy at the Scottish Rugby Union, she's helping to shape the future of women's sport and has just launched a 4-year strategy to drive the growth of the women's and girls game in Scotland. So, Gemma, firstly, a huge congratulations on launching that.
Thank you very much.
I'm also joined by Haifa Talou. Haifa is a sociologist who aims to connect sports authorities with social science research, giving those who are often forgotten the chance to have a say on the issues that they face and in shaping the solutions that must be found. Her focus is on sport and health, representation of girls, working class women and Muslim women. From 2019, thanks and through her research, she began helping others to understand and take action on the hijab ban in French football. So before we begin, I want to say a big thank you to Gemma and Haifa for joining us today and for sharing their insights. We've had a few discussions before this session, and it's really, really interesting and exciting what they both have to say. So we're really, really privileged to have you with us. So whilst there's been a lot to celebrate in the gains in women's sport that we're all witnessing, Gemma and Haifa can attest that there is still far to go. And that's what we're going to talk about today in this session. So I'm going to start with, I've got a couple of questions individually for Gemma and Haifa, and then some questions for both of you to start this discussion. And in this one, we've not prepared any presentations, as we're just going to discuss the topic together. And then if there's time, really encourage the audience to put their questions through on the chat, and hopefully we have time to answer those today. And if not, we can follow up by emails afterwards. So Gemma, you've been in the women's game covering both the playing and the administration sides, and then also in 2 different sports, rugby and football. Can you share with us a bit more about your experiences and your perspective on where we are at with the development of the women's game, please?
Sure, and thank you for this opportunity. Just listening to that, I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. I like to go into male-dominated sports and just make a bit of noise. It's just something I'm drawn to. No, I jest a little bit, but not too much. So my background is I started playing football. I guess my story is somewhat typical of a Scottish girl that had 3 brothers, and when I was growing up, you got sent outside to play, and they liked football, so I kind of joined in, and that's where it came from. My experiences growing up were that I joined my first girls team when I was 12, I think, because there wasn't anything else below that. And my first league that I participated in took me basically from one end of Scotland to the other, which takes about 5 hours to drive. So we've gone from a place where there was limited accessibility, 0 visibility, and really low perceptions about women or girls involved in football to a much, much better place. But there is this perception of where we are with women's sport versus the reality of where the majority of women are in sport. And the two don't necessarily align. I guess for me, in terms of having had a unique perspective of gone from being purely amateur athlete into a semi-professional, into a professional at the end of my career, I've had the opportunity to kind of go through the different stages of evolution. I would say that football, from my perspective, has somewhat paved the way to a certain extent for other sports, a team sports that is, in terms of that professionalization and showing what can happen. I would say particular in terms of what the English FA have done in investing in a sport for a number of years, understanding that there was value in doing that, but having a really long-term strategy towards that. It's only in the last few years that we start to see broadcasting deals done for the WSL down south. We start to see sellout matches for the English football team. That wasn't always the case, and I probably doubt that it's money making at this moment in time. I think we're probably still a way off break even, and that's part of the conversation that we should be having moving forward. But that kind of movement from amateurism into professionalism, it is a difficult one. It is a difficult one, and it requires foresight. And you start to make a dent in the top end of the game, and you start to pay players a little bit of money, and you raise the perception, and you give increased visibility. But the reality is, as is the case in most professional sports, below that 5%, there's still massive inequalities that do exist. We talk about access to facilities, and if I talk about the professional game, then I can drop down and talk about the kind of grassroots participation game. And I'm going to talk about the game, but what I mean is across, I work in rugby just now, we could probably say the same. The parallels are there, and it's the common denominator are females, are girls, and are women. And the kind of common thread that goes through there is we've been through a phase of, for many years, for decades, where women were suppressed in male-dominated environments, such as rugby, such as football. And we're now in a place in society where there is this movement that's happening. And I've been through many false dawns in women's sport, where everybody said it would be the next big thing. But now I think society, and I encapsulate society as a whole in terms of what I'm involved in, I know this is not the case in every single country and every single culture, is more accepting and more demanding of women in sport and sees the value in it. So at the top end, we do have more visibility. We have big name teams coming in to create women's teams to be part of something. We have a fully professional, if we look at England, we have a fully professional WSL. If we look at Scotland, we've just gone to SWFL, so the male equivalent. And we now have established a new league up here. But the disparity in terms of pay and conditions, and I mean conditions as in facilities, access to the highest level of coaching, the highest level of physio, S&C, health insurance, is so vast, and it's such a big gap between those that have it all and those that don't. It would probably shock some people to know, and I'm not just talking about up in Scotland, I'm talking that probably still exists in England as well. And I guess for me, the kind of key there is when we move something towards professional position, there's an expectation and a perception from the public that, you know, they compare it to the male game. They compare it to what men earn, they compare it, and there's a perception that there's it won't be as high as that, but it won't be far off that. The reality is it's very far off that. And these women today and the women of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, were the ones that kind of laid the foundation for these athletes today. And these athletes today have a responsibility which is different from their predecessors and their pioneers, which is to make sure that they move it on again, to make sure that they are saying, actually, it's not right that we have 1 or 2 or 3 players that earn this, and actually we're playing against teams where the level of funding is not there. It's not right that we don't have sustainable business plans in place. We should demand that should be the case. It's not right that we now have a system where academies are the thing that if you can't get to an academy, if you can't get into an academy, that affects your ability to be a professional footballer. We've removed the notion of play from inner cities. It's no longer deemed safe for a child to be on the street and kick a ball about. We have no ball game signs up in housing estates. So this natural ability to learn and develop and socialize is taken away. So everything is now structured. And if we, and this is just talking about from my background, which is a Caucasian background, from a, middle class background, it was difficult enough for me to get to that. But if you then talk about a background where you have a low income family in an area of high deprivation, we're starting to take the game of the people away from the people. So these are just some of the inequalities that exist. And I haven't even started to touch on the fact that if I look at the Scottish national team, if I am from an ethnic minority, I can't see myself there. I can't see myself in the coaching staff. I can't see myself in the physios. And that's something that we have to tackle. And it's across many, many sports. And we still haven't got there in terms of how do we and I know we're going to talk a little bit about inclusion, but how do we make female sport inclusive to all females, not just to those females that can access it? So it's a little bit of my experience, a little bit of my thoughts on the steps that we probably need to take to move forward into truly inclusiveness when it comes to female sport.
Thank you so much, Dana. Yeah, you you touched on so many really, really important points there, and I think I'm just going to pick out one around the disparity between pay and conditions. And a lot of the time, the conversation is focused on equal pay, which is obviously necessary, but if you don't have the conditions in addition to that, then it's going to hold back the growth of the women's game for sure. You've led really, really nicely into a question for Haifa, so I'm going to bring Haifa in now too, and that's around, does the women's game truly represent the society that we live in? Haifa, you've been active in trying to reverse the hijab ban in French football, and it'd be great if you could first tell us a bit more about that, and what the impact of that ban really is for both for the women, for Muslim women, and also for the sport itself. So yeah, over to you, Haifa, and thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this important discussion. I think, as a researcher doing, sociology and qualitative analysis, my work is really to see what lies behind the concepts, and through representation and discourse analysis, and maybe to co-construct, guides and recommendation, really inclusive with all. It's important to know also that Islamophobia in France, it's increasing, and especially those women who wear the hijab. And yeah, I started the reflection in 2019 with Fair Network, and thanks to Fair Network and also Women Win, to open the discussion and to give the voice to women themselves, the players, and to see what's happened on the field, why they cannot play their sport, why there is a difference between Muslims, women, and others. And it was interesting to see that, of course, it's complex, and with this complexity, we have to be very strategic and to deconstruct, even if it's easy to say that, but really to deconstruct. And that's why they organized themselves as a collective in May 2020. And they, it's really a collective work with the work and the voice of the hijabers themselves, but also, how do you say, an alliance, an union. The name is Alliance Citoyenne, and myself as a research actors doing action research. And it's the consequences. It's hard because we open the Pandora box. No one wants to open these box because they are just afraid that they will explode. And it's a very important subject for us, for Muslims women, for hijabis, by hijabis, and with the hijabis. We see at the girls' level, at the women's level, we note exclusion, humiliation. They stop playing football. They gain weight. Some of them fall into depression, loneliness. Very little of them fall into very little support from coaches, teammates who don't want, who don't understand much about the situation. There is no real solid explanation. That's the first, constat. We see that first. But we also listen to what kind of argument they give to them, and they said it's like that. There is nothing to do, and you know, if a girl wants to play, she just has to take off her headscarf, and if she really wants to play, and this creates, of course, guilt, doubt, and she ends up thinking maybe it's her fault. Her headscarf is the problem. This creates a lot of misunderstanding, of frustration, and the majority of hijabis will stop playing football to avoid making waves and to stop experiencing humiliation and violence. And the families who were against football will not support them and tell them, I told you sport, it's not possible, or France does not want you on the football field, I told you. You can see the consequences, the bad consequences in terms of play together, live together. The girl, they really want to play and to be include in the society. But because of this reaction, you provoke what you don't want to see, what you don't want to create. And that's the first problem. And the second thing, it's the uncertainty about the ban. It's not clear. At the low level, it's possible to play because the referee is a local and it's not an official, and you know, it's not really an issue important. But when you want to play in a better level, it's complicated because the referee will apply the law, the rules of the FFF. It's important to see also the motivation and the determination of the women, the players. The most motivated of them, they will get a medical certificate to be allowed to wear a helmet and therefore to be able to cover their hair. But the referees can also ban them for playing because they judge that it's for religious reasons. You see the hypocrisy of the situation. And this is the first constat, is to be able to see this hypocrisy, to see maybe to give a better understanding of the right, and to be able to go with the women themselves for their right to play. And I can add something in connection with the point of view of sport actors. They have no legal reference in this area. They apply what the FFF wants them to apply. And even if they personally see that there is something wrong, they cannot contradict the rules, because if they want to progress in their refereeing careers, for example, he has to, or she has to apply the rule. But also if they want to receive the necessary subsidies for the club, if he or she is a leader or a coach, they just have to apply the rules. It's just un cercle vicieux. It's very negative circle. We have to cut it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing more about that, about the work that you're doing in that area, and I'll definitely be following it with great interest as it develops. There we've kind of delved into one area of discrimination within women's sport. From your experience, what do you think for the audience here today as well? What can we learn from that campaign to ensure that women's sport becomes more inclusive for everybody? To Haifa.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It's really a process to deconstruct and to implicate, to involve all the important persons. Of course, the main concern, but also all the stakeholders, the actors, the referees, politicians, any citizen who are aware about what does it mean, rights, and what is important to respect rights issues. But first of all, we have to start with the hijabers themselves, and just to open the discussion, and to liberalization of speech, to create a safe and kind space. It's important, and because there's so many violence and fear, you have to create this space to reduce the mental burden and to protect them against violence, but also to teach them to to work with them on their rights, to know their rights well in terms of secularism, right to all to practice sports, freedom of conscience, the right to manifest one's religious belief. It's really important in France and also in the world, but also to understand the reality of these peoples, the obstacles and the difficulties, to analyze the representation and the discourses that exist in the ground, the false discourses, the prejudices, and to be able to co-construct with all this, the important person. I think the main, of course, we are in legal aspect. We are now in front of the FFF. The hijabers are in front of the hijabers with the lawyer, and they really want to push back the FFF to a good application of the French law. But we have to co-construct guides and recommendations in connection with the reality of hijabis, because no one knows exactly what is the problem and difficulties of the hijabis and the specificity of the hijabis, to stop focusing on hijab, because they are just sports people like any others, and we have to show them in action, performing with pleasure. But also we have to educate people to respect alterity. And I said people, but also sports, others, allies, to understand, to be able to speak with them and stimulate the discussion positively. Well, after that, it's really recording cases, statistic evolution to alimentate the qualitative research. It's really what we need now. And after that, to provoke calls to action, because it's not satisfying to stay like that. To be immobile, we have to participate and to be concerned or not concerned. Different actors in different levels, national or international, we have to be active in this subject, because of course the mobilization is really about everyone. And if we deprive the right of a minority, you deprive in reality all that we have an impact on everyone. And that's what we want to provoke. And we are really happy to see the positive impact in the eyes of the hijabis themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you mentioned about the need to sort of consult those that are affected by the decisions that are being made. And that's something, I completely, wholeheartedly agree with, when we have to engage with the people that are being affected by the decisions that we make in sport, to really find solutions that are appropriate and suitable and actually improve sport as a whole. Through some of our discussions that we've had prior to this webinar, you've both got some strong thoughts about terminology, and particularly on the term inclusion. So let's, as you were saying, Haifa, let's deconstruct the word inclusion. And I'd love for you to share with the audience what inclusion really means for you and how it should be used when we think about the women's game. So we'll start with Gemma this time, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I have an interesting relationship with inclusion, because if you're talking about inclusion about females, we're 50% of the population. We're not here to be included. We are part of this world. And I have this love-hate relationship with the word, because I automatically think, well, if we're talking about inclusion, we are excluding people. We're actively excluding people by making it difficult for them to partake, for them to be part of something. And anybody that's ever been excluded from anything, be it a birthday party as a kid, knows the feeling that has. That feeling doesn't change as you grow old. To be told that for you to be included, we have to do something different, just puts a negative connotation on what essentially sport should be about, which is about a feeling of joy, that excitement you get when you interact with others that have a common interest. So for me, I understand why we use it. I do. And I understand why at times we have to be exclusive before we can be truly inclusive, because I feel at times that in certain aspects, if we're not saying this is for females and this is the reason why we're doing it, it can get lost in the wider male dominance that may exist within that sport, not through anybody's desire for that to happen potentially, but just because it isn't, as you say, business as usual. So part of the work that I've been doing is working really hard to almost educate around about what women's sport is, why it has a unique place, where it sits in its own landscape. There's a difference between doing things because it's the right thing to do for a certain population of people versus being inclusive. There's two really different things, because one is about listening and understanding needs. The other one is around about saying, oh, we need to have you involved in here and we have to take barriers down. They're two very different ways to look at things. And I'm very much on this side of things in terms of, at this moment in time, we don't have this population of people who are participating in our sport. Why is that? Why do you feel like you can? If you feel like you can, why do you choose not to? Or do you just not choose to? It's so this piece about understanding, really listening, and understanding the right questions to ask about how you make your sport more open to people is the kind of line that I like to take. That takes more energy, it takes more effort, and it takes the ability to listen and listen really carefully to what's coming back. And then the desire to look at what you currently do and say, okay, how do we open ourselves to allow people to enjoy what we enjoy? And you'll see the language I'm using is very deliberate, because how do we communicate in the world? Well, we communicate with our bodies and we communicate with language, don't we? And if the language that we use is set up with negative connotations from the outset, and it's almost like we have to change something or it's a chore for us to do this, then straight off the bat, that group of people who are not currently engaged in your sport for whatever reason, they're going to sense, that's what they will sense, because they're already feeling a negativity towards it because they're not involved. So for me, the word include, I mean, we've got a really deep dive into this word, but for me, it's really important. The language that we use when we talk about women's sport and women in sport, and how we engage rather than include, how we open up rather than become more inclusive, that for me is really important.
Yeah, thank you so much. I completely agree. If we're going to use words, we have to really understand what we're saying with them and the power of those words. Haifa, do you have anything to add to that as well?
Yeah, it's you know, in the case of inclusion, I'm always very surprised to see in France they use inclusion. You know, it's a really it's almost a magic term. You know, inclusion. It's so wonderful because you use it and there is no problem. You know, everything is beautiful, but in reality is about fighting discrimination and systemic barriers and the violence that result from them. And with reference to the criteria defined by the law, of course, ethnic origin, disability, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and etc. And in the areas provided by the law, for example, in the access to sport for all, or in the field of the employment of high-level athletes, I think it's important to have statistics, and you can imagine in that specific population, you know, Muslims, women, in poor population, from, you know, ethnic minority groups. It's complicated because in France, we are not authorized to produce statistics in race, on race issues. That's the first problem, because how can you fight discrimination and be really inclusive if you don't have statistics? Well, we have to produce other analyze, and that's what I'm doing, but it's long and we have to invest and we have to pass a lot of time to discuss and to, you know, to be in confidence with women, but it's, you know, it's important and it's good. It's really good. I think it's the other thing that always I'm surprised in France. They spoke about fighting discrimination, and by a way, inclusion, but they spoke only to the participation of women in responsibilities, like, you know, if you are director or, I don't know, leader, we have to have women and men in that position, but they forgot to put all the others, minorities, around the table. You know, there is something wrong. How people can still continue in that orientation. But the problem also is to slowly to say that, okay, well, we have to invite Black women, minorities, lesbians, trans, I don't know, all the different population. But also you have to understand more what's happened on the ground, and also to have this connection between the representativity of the responsibility of the minority in each level of responsibility, and that we don't have it in France, and that's why maybe I don't know, I don't want to say that, but maybe they don't want to really produce an inclusive society, more inclusive in sport. I don't want to be so negative, but that's the power of this campaign. It's when you see it, when you see the mistake, you cannot. It's impossible to stay and do nothing. You have to be active to change and to be inclusive, really, and to change the mind of everyone. You know, you can change only if you are doing stuff for yourself, by yourself, and with the minority, with the group.
Thank you, Haifa. Yeah, you mentioned there about the importance of having that foundation of statistics and of qualitative data as well to then actually take action. And Jemmy, you mentioned before about we can't just rest upon the success of previous pioneers in women's sport, and we have to, each generation has to take action in this to take it further forward. So for both of you, what do you think this current generation needs to do, and what will the next generation need to confront to improve women's football and other sports?
I mean, if we just take a look across the pond about what's happening in terms of women's rights in general, I think we have they have a massive opportunity, but and this is one that kind of gets lost sometimes because previous generations have fought for what they have now. What's important for this generation to realize is we're not there yet, and that very quickly, if you stop and sit still and just unfortunately enjoy what you have, and that's all that you do, the next ones that come in will not have that, and we will regress, because you must continue. Every one of us must continue to fight for our rights. We must continue to fight for what is right. There is a status quo in nature that men are all powerful and women are not, because that's, you know, Mother Nature. That's how she. And that's what we're fighting against the whole time, because we as humans have agreed roughly what we believe, you know, what is right, what is wrong, who should have this, and we're evolving all the time with that. And sport is like this microcosm of society, isn't it? You know, what happens at society is reflected within sport, and sometimes sport goes ahead of society, and society catches up with sport. So it is a powerful beast, and these athletes that are there within the sport at this moment in time, I think they are more aware than any athlete generation before the power and the responsibility that they have for more than what they do on a sports field or on a court or in a swimming pool or on a running track. They are far, far more in tune and connected with the responsibility they have in the sense of showing diversity, showing that you can achieve regardless of what your background or where you come from, showing the struggles that they've had that they continue to have. And I think that that's important, and that this generation needs to continue to do that piece, as well as continuing the championing the improvement of everything around the sporting piece as well. And that's different for this generation than I think any other, because they are so much about their life is there for anybody to see and anybody to judge. And that wasn't the case when I was growing up. When I was growing up, I mean, I made several mistakes, both on and off the field, but nobody saw them. Nobody heard about them because there wasn't cameras and there wasn't social media. So we're asking these athletes to be these powerful symbols of change, instigators of something new and something better moving forward, but we're asking them to do it under a magnifying glass. And that for me is something that I don't think any generation has ever had to face before. And I think a majority of them are doing an excellent job.
Thank you. Yeah, we've sadly run out of time there, but I just wanted to finalize with something that you've both talked about there around the repercussions if we don't make the women's game more inclusive. And it leads to so many other aspects that this alliance has talked about today. Haifa, you mentioned, you know, if Muslim women don't have access to sport, there's an issue with gaining weight. It can have an impact on mental health. So that's why I think this session has really shown why women's sport needs to be more inclusive, and we need to create these alliances where we connect the different groups working on various different topics around social change. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to be in this session with you. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mel Young, who's going to kick off the session on what is the future direction of sport and social change initiatives. So yeah, thanks again, everyone.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this fourth session. As Joanna said, this session is entitled, What is the Future Direction of Sport and Social Change Initiatives? What three great sessions we've had already today, full of some really rich content, some very, very relevant discussion, I felt, to the overall topic of sport development generally and where sport is going. This topic here is, the description of it is really, we're living in a time of unfettered social change, where winning at all costs doesn't seem to have the same appeal as perhaps it once did. What has sport's role been, and how does it affect the way we approach sport in the future? So that's the subject of today's discussion. I'm pleased that we have three fabulous speakers to join us in a kind of panel debate discussion. We're not going to be doing presentations in this session. We'll have just general discussion about this topic and where we're going in the future. So we have three great speakers, as I say. Paul Hunt, who's the Senior Project Manager at the International Platform for Sport and Dev, nicknamed by a lot of us as just Sport and Dev, I think. But it's been around in this sector for a very long time, a platform of more than 1,000 organizations using sports, economic, environment, development, and is hugely respected and valued as a network. Then we also have Rico Rakic, who is a snow sports industry veteran with over 15 years experience of various management roles, including the International Ski Federation and at major events. She is currently overseeing the transformation of a 7-year strategic plan called Target 26 at the International Biathlon Union. So a small sport, but one which is well known and effective. And it's a very progressive winter sports in the Olympic program. And she's also managing an ambitious sustainability program as well, which we'll come on and talk to her about in a moment. Also joining us, I can't see her on screen, but hopefully in a minute or two, is Lucy Mills, who's from the Fundación Basia. She works at international projects there. She's also on the board of directors of Lewis FC, advises on women's football, was a lecturer, and has particular interest in Web 3.0 tech innovation and where we're going forward. Just where I'm coming from, this going to facilitate this session. I'm president of and co-founder of the Homeless World Cup, which was established in 2003, and we simply use football as a way of tackling homelessness, and we've been effective in doing that since we started, with over 1.2 million people connected with our programs, changing their lives. So it just shows and demonstrates the power of football amongst the most marginalized people in the world. We have an annual tournament, which is the kind of culmination of all of our work. But unfortunately, it's had to be cancelled these past 3 years due to the pandemic, which has set us back. But more importantly, it's probably set homeless people and our homeless organizations back as well. So we have a lot more to do in the world. But I think we can demonstrate clearly the power of sport and the power of football in that example. I have another hat on as chair of Sport Scotland, which is the National Agency for Sport, which is funded by the government and lottery, and actually supports all sports across Scotland, and supports sport at all levels, from those who are most excluded, disabled, etc., and trying to bring them to sport together as one. But the Sports Agency is interested in winning medals, sports winning medals, and will support that. But the view of the organization is that sport is one system. It's not different parts. There's not an excluded inclusion part or a medals part, high performance part. It's all part of one system, and it's developed a strategy called Sport for Life. So I have these two hats on, where I can see the power of sport coming from an NGO side, if you like, but also where sport's going in terms of its strategic development and some of its policy thinking globally from a government and an international governing body perspective. So I'd like to probably start in that area, and maybe turn to you first, Paul. I mean, you're working with these over 1,000 organizations, which we know are all tiny, and have fantastic impact, huge amount of work and effort they do, but they're all really struggling with small budgets. As against, on the other side, some of these bigger organizations which have substantial funds in different countries in the world, really substantial funds, which with the focus has been on medals. But there seems to be a bit of a change in that now a lot of these big governing bodies are now starting to talk about impact. They're starting to talk about a language actually that you would have been speaking about a lot. So are we seeing a change here where there's a convergence starting to emerge between some of the aims and objectives in the sport and development sector with the overall larger sports industry sector? I'd love to hear your view.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the introduction, Mal, and also to the panelists and moderators from the previous sessions. It's been really engaging to listen to you, as well as to all the attendees. It's great to see so many people online. It's a really interesting question to begin with, I think, which is something that, as you acknowledge, we've thought about quite a lot on Sport and Dev. I think the short answer to the question is that there has been a lot of progress in this regard, but there is still a lot to be done. I wouldn't say there is full convergence between the kind of network of sport for development organizations or organizations that identify as such with the wider sport community, where there's an increasing sense of importance when it comes to social responsibility. The majority of sports federations, for example, and also a growing number of major sports clubs in different sports have social responsibility programs and budgets. This is something which just wasn't the case 20 years ago. But if we look at kind of the bigger picture, it's still the reality that there's a massive amount of inequality and disproportionate amount of funding that goes to, for example, bringing medals to countries at Olympic Games. So we do very much advocate for, while welcoming the fact that there is an increasing acknowledgement that sport is not just about medals and performance and success at major tournaments, we do advocate very strongly for an increasing acknowledgement that it can, when properly managed, be of huge benefit to society on a number of different levels as well, while welcoming that there have been steps in that direction over the last 20 years.
So just coming back on that, Paul, because it's interesting there. I mean, what you're saying in a sense is there's a bit of a contradiction going on. In point of fact, some football clubs or a lot of football clubs are actually doing good work in the community. A lot of sports also kind of beginning to talk about their impact. But still, there's a huge gap between the two. If you look at golf, for example, at the moment, you've got this breakaway golf organization backed by the Saudis, where one player is going to get paid 110 million, which I suspect dwarfs your entire budget easily. So isn't there some kind of complete disproportionality going on here, whereby, yes, people are maybe talking the game and walking the game, but it's still peanuts compared with where we might be getting to. So how can we kind of change that balance, do you think, between the two areas?
Yeah, I would agree with the statement. It is peanuts compared to the amount of budget which is going to social responsibility programs, and the statement that you make also touches on another topic of conversation, which is actually the source of funding, and how do we feel as a sport for social change sector about the increasing amount of funding that comes from governments that have issues when it comes to human rights and so on. And it's a very tricky gap to bridge, because the reality is that as sport needs funding, so does sport for change organizations, and we're not quite yet in a position where we have the luxury to be able to say no often to problematic sources of funding. It depends on the organization, of course, but there's a lot of different issues contained within that comment, and it is a very tricky one.
So just turning to you, Rika. No, I can't see Lucy anywhere online, so I'm presuming at the moment she's not with us. So I can't see her, so I'm presuming she's not around. So if somebody could put a message in the chat to let me know, that would be great. But I'm presuming for the moment she's not here.
Daniel has been trying to get in contact with her.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Anyway, we plow on. Rika, listening to this conversation, you know, you're part of a governing body and part of a sport that's, you know, funded well. Do you think that actually, in some of the work that you're doing in this plan that you're doing, that governing bodies can change and then connect much more into this sport and development sector, so that it almost becomes part of their DNA and not only about medals?
Yes, thank you, Mel. Nice to be with you all today here in this conversation. And also I just want to say congratulations to the team behind this new Sport and Social Change Alliance. It's great to have a platform that will kind of frame this discussion going forward. But yes, I do think that we as international governing bodies have a role to play. And as you say, our sport is lucky to be well funded, but it's also a very small sport in terms of grassroots or mass sport participation, but we are lucky to be a very visible sport as one of the most popular winter sports on television in big European markets such as Germany or France. So that gives us a big platform, and I think that's what we have seen, is that we as a sport want to assume that responsibility that we think we have as being a leading sport on the Olympic program, to also lead change and no longer just be entertainment or sportainment, I think, as we have been called in the past. We are spectacular and very exciting sport to watch, but we also want to have a role to play and using that platform that we have as a great popular sport for lots of fans around the world, and use that platform to actually effect change. So yes, I do think we can play that role. It's maybe not a natural role for us. It certainly hasn't been the role that international governing bodies have kind of focused on in the past. The main role has been in kind of professionalizing the top level elite sport and trying to obviously generate revenues through that. But I think that the world has changed and we have seen a different mission.
Okay, well, that's really, really interesting, because as I was saying earlier, you talk about this kind of convergence and coming together and understanding. Where's that coming from in your organization? Is that coming from the athletes, or is it coming at a board level, or are you being pushed by funders, or is it just a kind of view of everybody in the organization that, hey, the world is changing, you know, there's different values out there, particularly amongst young people for the sport? Where's it coming from? And then the other point of that question would be, because you know, a lot of the work that you're doing is around sustainability and within the sport. And you know, when we were speaking earlier, you know, you're talking about the receding amount of snow and so on. You need snow for the sport, so it does link into climate change. And is that some pressure you're getting from younger people around this as well? I'd just be interested in your views in that space.
Yeah, I think the pressure to change in our case definitely comes from climate change. We are winter sport. We need snow for our sport to flourish. We obviously also need to think about what happens when we no longer have snow, but at the moment we're still really concerned about keeping our sport as it is, a sport that happens on white, lovely, fluffy snow. So that's where it comes from. And then also our athletes, we recently conducted a survey just around Christmas time, where we asked our global athletes whether they're concerned about climate change, and actually close to 90% of them said that they are concerned about the long-term sustainability of our own sport, and they actually think that future generations can no longer as easily have access to the sport, because where they used to train as kids, when you know, you don't have the ability to travel far to find your training space, they could no longer train. So their home trails are no longer available for skiing. So this is a concern that they have, and obviously this is a concern shared by our entire community. And so we have a natural connection to that social change that's required for us to effectively fight climate change. But we are trying to take a bigger picture look at that. And we also want to make our sport more open and welcoming to everyone. We have been traditionally very white in European sports, so we'd like to also embrace other types of participants in our sport and make it available to maybe social classes that haven't traditionally been able to afford our sport, where you need not only expensive ski equipment, but also you need a rifle, which tends to be a pretty big hurdle for many.
So in point of fact, what you're seeing there is just briefly then is that, you know, as a sport, you begin to realize, hey, our long-term viability actually is in question for all sorts of external reasons and changes. So therefore, you're having to change and look to new markets, if you like, or new people, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of that, that means you make a greater impact in the wider community in different ways. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why we also have embraced the situation and the challenge. And that's why I think you mentioned at the very beginning that we have this 7-year program called Target 26, which is a very transformative program for the entire organization. And we are now about 3 years into it. So lots of changes are already taking place, but we have a lot more work to do.
Thanks. So hi Lucy, and welcome. We've obviously just been having a kind of discussion about, you know, where sport's going to go here, and you know, the potential convergence or otherwise between the traditional sports industry and governing bodies and the wider sport development sector. In some ways you straddle the two. I'm really interested in discussions we were having earlier about where you saw the future of sport, and in particular Web 3.0, technological innovation here. Something largely ignored by our sector, if you like, partly because we're so busy actually working on the front line doing other things. It's not that we don't care about it, but you know, you were telling a different story about how this development could be really, really impactful for us as a sector. And I'd love to hear, I think all of us would love to hear your thoughts on where this might drive the future of our sector. So yeah, great to hear from you, Lucy.
Great, thanks Mel, and great to see you again, Rika, Paul, Daniel, and yeah, congratulations on putting together this new alliance. It's really, really exciting and needed, and So I'm actually calling in from Arsenal football ground, and coincidentally I'm at a summit that is about Web3 and sport. And so you'll see many of the big brands, media, rights holders, leagues, clubs, they're all here thinking about this emerging technological revolution, as we say, Web 3.0, right? And so it's kind of timely that I'm also on this panel today talking about the potential impacts and changes that this new technology, that these new tools that are opening up and affording us with new ways to engage with people, and the relevance that they have for our sectors of sport and social change. So many of you know me from my work at Barca Foundation, so I'm very much embedded in the sport and social change sector and movement. I've been working in sport for development for the last 15, 18 years, half of that time based in Southern Africa and the latter half here in Europe. But really my curiosity, I mean, I'm a curious person, so continuously learning and getting excited, intrigued by new things. So the past few years, it has really been an on and off interaction, relationship, keeping an eye out on Bitcoin, right, as the first as the trigger for the catalyst for this world of Web 3.0, so cryptocurrencies, right? And then really started to consolidate my interest during the pandemic, when I guess all of us were at home and we had more time, and I started to see that actually this really baffling, confusing, hyped, volatile, unregulated space was much more than cryptocurrencies, right? And so I think I'm not from a tech background, but I have an interest in the technology as potential tools for us as practitioners and managers and strategy thinkers to think about how we should start thinking about and applying these tools within our work. And so that's a little bit of background as to why I'm talking today about Web3, coming from actually a sport for development practitioner background. And so I think that the panel here, right, is about sport in the future and sport and social change in the future. And I really feel that it's undeniable that the sands of society are shifting underneath our feet. And I sound very dramatic when I say that, but I kind of want really our sector to start being curious and to start dipping our toes in to what this new technology that's driven by blockchain, what it is and what it might mean for us. And so the general term of Web 3.0, some of you have probably seen this, you know, the term, or you've probably seen some of the concepts and the features that are under this umbrella concept of Web3, like cryptocurrencies, NFTs, metaverse, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. And actually the reality is that we're seeing a lot of these concepts and terms being applied in sport today in different forms, right? So we're seeing them in moving from traditional collectibles to digital collectibles, right? So people can have can buy and invest in and have ownership over certain assets of their favorite athletes or their favorite clubs. We're seeing, of course, some NFT projects that many of them have been quite unsuccessful, and we need to think about why that is. Maybe ahead of the times, maybe introduced in questionable ways, but nevertheless, they're existing in the world of sport today. And we're also seeing some interesting forms of how people are organizing themselves around projects and capital, and this includes sports clubs too. So new collective forms of ownerships for sports clubs. So we're seeing a lot of Web3 application in sport today. In fact, this 2-day conference that I'm at right now is talking about a whole range of application of blockchain powered tools and technology. And so I think a couple of observations that I'm seeing. One is, of course, that a lot of this innovation is happening in high-end professional sport, because many people are thinking about how to generate revenue and drive fan engagement and commercialize and so on. And so I'm a little bit concerned that we might be I think the sport for development sector has done a great job in influencing and in bringing sport together. In Mel, we talked about this parallel sometimes that exists, right, between kind of professional sport and social change. So I think I felt very optimistic about the direction that sport for development sector has been going and the influence that we've had on sport. But I'm a little bit concerned that with this emergence of this technology that is now where top professional sport is thinking about it, and I'm just a little bit concerned that we as a sector, if we don't get ahead of this, that we will get further left behind, and the divides will kind of open up again. And then I'm seeing it from a women's sport perspective, right? So case in point, it's the majority of participants in this conference today are men, and it's men's sport where a lot of this technological innovation is happening. So again, this is an important time. We're at a critical juncture in I would say the history of sport. We're thinking about the future of sport, and the tools that are afforded to us within Web3, like blockchain powered tools, they're just tools. And so we need to be applying the same inclusivity and consultation. We need to have the same approach that we always have had, or we try to have in our sector when we're designing and using these new tools. So yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing is that some projects are putting Web3 on them, and they're saying that that's solving the problem, that it's inclusive and so on, and it's just not true. The same repeated patterns are happening, and so I just think that because we as a sector come at it with a different perspective, that we're very people focused, we try to have an inclusive lens and approach where possible, that we're really well placed to learn about and to apply the tools that are opening up to us within this new space, and there are possibilities that can benefit the sector in terms of new forms of fundraising, new ways of engaging people, new ways of organizing and building communities. So that's just a little bit of my thoughts on the topic in relation to the future and where I'm at with it all.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for that insight. It's important. It's certainly, when people start talking to me anyway about blockchain and stuff like that, it goes right over my head, but I think that might be to do with my age or something. But it's a very valid point, I think, that you make about, it's typical of the people who have resource, large or sport organizations get onto something that's potentially a new innovative, and they invest in it, whether it's going to work or not, they invest in it. And if it works well, they're way ahead. Whereas our sector, we simply can't do that. And I'm not really aware of anybody who's looking at this Web 3.0 at the moment, or blockchains. What about you, Paul and Rika? Paul, is this something that's popping up on your agenda you're hearing at all? And should it?
Yeah, so just I guess a general comment regarding the use of technology in the sport for development sector. First of all, I would make a couple of observations. One is that the pandemic in particular has shown kind of the potential of technology to be used more effectively by sport for development organisations. So when COVID-19 started to spread around the world and there were lockdowns, obviously this created major challenges for sport for development organisations whose tool for achieving social objectives is getting people together in the same space to run sports activities. Many of them were very creative in the way they responded to this not being possible during lockdowns by running some of those activities from through online means, enabling people to get together and continue connections online, or even physical activity sessions, moving curriculums online. And then there was a second element of this where webinars proliferated during the pandemic. So there were more and more webinars as ways to share knowledge. And I think those will never replace in-person events, but they do have some advantages. One being that it enables us to reach people in parts of the world that where they wouldn't have the means to actually attend in-person conferences. A quick caveat to that is that there is also a digital divide where some people in some parts of the world have better access to internet and online means than others. So that's something to be aware of too. However, from my point of view, the conversation about blockchain technology and Bitcoin and so on is very new. I haven't heard this discussed very widely within the sport for development sector, and from that point of view I find it very interesting to listen to Lucy talking about this and sort of advocating it for a way forward. There were comments about the risk that the sport for development sector gets left behind, and I think kind of the what I've just described there, the ways that the sport for development sector is adapting with its use of technology in comparison to the discussions which are happening in the sports sector, which does have more resources and so on. There is a big difference in scale there. So there's probably some truth to the point that there may be a risk that sport for development organisations get somewhat left behind, even though I would argue that within the more limited resources that those organisations have, there is some level of adaptation to the circumstances.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Maybe sometime in the future we're all going to be dealing in bitcoins with each other and stuff like that, and be much smarter than the rest of the sports sector and get ahead.
Mel, yeah, sorry, just
before you come back in, could I ask just Rika to just come back in on this from your side, Rika, because you know, with the governing body, you know, basically, is this sort of discussion happening there as well, or is this just not on the agenda? And what's your kind of view on where this might be going with blockchain technology?
Well, I admit we're definitely still in Web 2.0 world in biathlon, but we have invested a lot in putting in place what we call a new digital ecosystem, which is supposed to be the engine that will allow us to also, with some more time, to kind of upgrade ourselves to Web 3.0. But we felt that we needed this backbone in place before kind of moving to the next level, because we think that the new technologies are the way that we can communicate and really harness the power of our platform that our sport have, because if we're not effectively able to communicate with the global fan base, we are also not able to kind of get them you know, with us on this journey that we are hoping to change, especially fight the climate, the changes in climate, and engaged with them more effectively than we currently do. So that's kind of where we are as a sport. But I also have very much welcome the opportunities that the new technologies have brought to us by allowing us to have these discussions in the digital world, and that's not creating any more CO2 emissions than the travel would have. You know, the same meetings that were now taking place online would never have taken place if we had to always travel. So it has two sides of the coin that are, I think, both beneficial.
Sides of the Bitcoin, yeah, thank you. It's very true. It's both dark and light, I think. So I interrupted you, Lucy, to bring Rika in there. You were going to come back on this, and if you could do that quickly, because I'm just aware of the time, and I have one more question.
No, yeah, go for it. Yeah, Rika's comment was way more profound than mine.
Okay, well, I think the whole issue of Web 3 and blockchain stuff could have a whole session on its own, maybe a whole half day on its own. That's for sure. Maybe that's something we could take up and have a look at. Well, we're coming to the end of this, but time moves so fast. But the one question I want to ask each of you then is, okay, the question was, what is the future direction of sport and social change initiative? So, I mean, what is it? If there's 2 or 3 areas that we should be practically working on now. So I'm a social entrepreneur, so I was like having a chat and then saying, okay, what are we doing? So what are we going to be doing here? What is the future direction? What should we be doing that's going to make a difference to all of us and the lives of people generally on the planet? So who wants to go first? I'll maybe go in a different order this time. So maybe Lucy, if you could answer, right? Practically, where are we going? What is the direction, the future direction for sport and change?
I'm really optimistic. I think there are so many different ingredients that are lining up for us as a sector, as a movement, the type of thinking that has been going on, the social, socially conscious young people that are entering into the world, the way that even companies and other stakeholders are thinking about and being forced to have purpose and social impact much more closer to what they're offering and what they're investing in. And I think there's this success of the last 20 years of the sector really by everybody on this call and many more people. So I'm optimistic. I think that we need to keep tight because the world is full of divisions and competition, and I think the thing that I'm really enjoying about the Web3 space is that there's this new conversation happening about how do we reimagine society? How can we restructure humans around projects and capital, and how can we think about things in society that are actually public goods and that we should be investing in them and to have more like regenerative economics, right? So and like community is the pandemic saw that we craved to be part of something. We crave community. So I think as a sector, if we can overcome the competitive aspect or the fighting for resources or the and this is why this alliance actually is brilliant, because you're coming together with recognizing strengths and pitching in, and I think the community is something that will define the coming 10 years. And now we have the technology and the tools available to us to facilitate easy transactions, easy peer-to-peer share flow of value and wealth, and so to maximize that. So I would say I'm positive, I'm optimistic. I think collaboration, continued collaboration, and yeah, I think that's like my message to end on this note, really.
Thanks, Lucy. That's very positive. So, and that's great. I think that's the right space we all need to be in. And I do agree with you. I think there are lots of good things happening in the world. The young people are really getting it, but equally there's a lot of really difficult things going on at the same time. So it's a total contradiction. But from what you are saying is, it's about keeping together, keeping tight, focusing on impact, not being competitive, understanding community, coming together like this alliance, being part of that. And then of course it's being about being innovative, which you've just underlined, because you're talking about the development of technology and how we would use it. So those were some of your inputs then on practically how the future direction of sport might emerge. Thank you very much for that. So Rika, your shot.
Yeah, maybe just quickly. My favorite podcast is called Outrage and Optimism, and I'm going to say 2 things. One thing that I'm optimistic about, which is I think is the thing that I see a lot of great work being done in sport, and sports seeing its role in affecting social change as well. And I think that should continue that way, I hope. At the same time, I'm outraged that there are still so many people, it's just if I look at sport alone, that don't think that it's actually their responsibility. And you mentioned earlier that contract for 110 million euros. That's just ridiculous. Like, I don't think that is really showing that responsibility that we ought to see everyone kind of assuming. So yeah, both sides to the coin again. I would like to see more of the collaboration and taking responsibility.
So collaboration, taking responsibility. I guess the difficult question that I'm going to ask you on that then, just while we're still here, is, okay, we want to do that, and that's grand aims, and we want to do that. And people who believe in sport, by the way, we're competitive, but we're inclusive. So we get all of this. But how are we actually going to stop when organizations and huge conglomerates emerge with so much money that they can make an intervention into sport and turn it into something else that it's not? So paying one player 110 million actually upsets the entire balance in sport and actually gives sport a pretty bad reputation, when we know, all of us know, the potential power of it. And if it was investment into the area that we're working in, it would have so much of an impact in wider society. So the question is, how do we stop this sort of thing happening? How do we, as a sector, bring these people to book, and so that we can be working on one strategy which is funded properly to create the change that we all crave? How do we do that? Rika, you have an answer? Is it just governments bringing in laws and rules, or governing bodies being more held to account, or what is it? What's going to stop this commercial drive? And we had earlier sessions talking about, you know, commercial advertising and marketing and so on, and their investment. And so using sport for commercial outcomes rather than using sport for society or sustainable outcomes that we're doing. How do we do that? How do we tackle something like what's happened with in golf?
Is that question to me or Paul?
Yeah, you actually.
I think typically that kind of change only happens when people themselves are personally concerned, and when it really hits them home. I think that's the challenge we have with climate change now. It doesn't seem to be really impacting our everyday life, but I think so I think if it comes to that big sport type of decision making, then I think it will have to impact the leagues, the top leagues that are no longer actually able to operate at the level they're operating now. They still feel confident enough about future when they are able to make that investment in a single player at that level. So there needs to be something that is really threatening them, unfortunately. And I don't have the crystal ball to tell you what we need to actually change it, but that's my feeling. Maybe Paul, you have another view on that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it is. I'm sorry if it's a difficult question, which none of us can really answer except by being together. And I think some of the answers Lucy gave, you know, in terms of our future direction. But Paul, just, you know, we are seriously running a little over time now. Maybe we could finish with you the future direction then, and you know, from all your 1,000 members, you'll have heard their views and so on. What's your view here? Is there potential for the bigger, wider sports world to come together behind what we're doing, collaborate with us? Can we build a sector which is going to be effective without them? What's your thoughts, Paul?
So in response to that angle on the question, I think collaboration between different parts of the sport for development ecosystem is absolutely essential. NGOs need to collaborate with sports federations, with sports clubs, and this is happening more and more, albeit imperfectly, but major improvements. And although there's still this gap, the alignment is becoming closer, and hopefully that trend will continue, even if not as fast as we might like it to. Just a quick comment that I wanted to highlight is that in terms of the general future, the main thing which we are hearing from our community, and this was related a bit to the discussion before where the two panelists were talking about the appropriateness of the term inclusion, and something that we're hearing time and time again is that we need to start practicing what we preach when it comes to principles of inclusion in the way that our organizations operate. And this is true for sports federations. It's also true for NGOs, where particularly on a governance and leadership level. We're still too male, we're still too white, we're still too driven by individuals from the global north. There's not enough representation from people with disabilities, and this is the big question is, of course, how. This is a very big topic, and there's a lot of different ways that steps can be taken. One small thing, I guess, which I wanted to emphasize is that I think there's not enough recognition that language is a source of inequality. So those of us who have the ability to communicate and understand English effectively have more access to information, more influence on policy and decision making, and so on. So one of the things that we are currently trying to look at more and more is just translating into different languages more. It's not going to solve the problem of structural inequalities in our sector, but it's just an example of something that we've been doing recently to try to make better steps in that direction.
Okay, Paul, well, thanks for that. So we're all really talking about ending up on a positive note, and even on that last point you're making there, which I think is a very valid one, Paul, about language and how English kind of dominates everything, and whether you like it or not. But, you know, to Lucy's point earlier, you know, we have technological advance, and you know, the technology is allowing so much better now in terms of translation online than ever before, and continues to improve. So all sorts of things are happening. But I think we could end this session, which has been a great session. Just thank you very much, Rika, Lucy, and Paul, for your insights and your contributions. But we're kind of talking about, you know, the future, very positive, very bright, sticking together. It is a changing world. It is difficult. No one's saying that this is easy, but we can see lots of potential by working together. So I'll probably end on that very positive note. Thank you again. Thanks to everyone. This is the end of the 4 sessions. I listened to the other 3. Thought they were great, and I want to at this point hand back to Daniel, who's got a couple of points he wants to make in just conclusion to today's events. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Mel, and thanks everyone. I'm not even going to attempt to wrap up the last 3 hours of really insightful debate. I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers and to our moderators. I think it's been a great team effort by everyone. Maybe I would just say I liked what Lucy just said. It's obviously on my mind because she just said it about keeping tight. The world is full of division and competition, and what we must aim for is continued collaboration. And that's certainly what we're trying to do here with the Alliance. In terms of our next steps, we had penned something for September, another webinar. We've had some suggestions already, particularly Web3, I think is probably an interesting angle to take, but there's many other interesting topics that we could maybe focus in on. And we're very open to collaboration. That's what we're all about. We're also, in terms of next steps, we're also going to be launching a website very soon. In the meantime, you'll be able to follow us on social media. And that's where you'll find the link to the recording of this webinar, which will be out as soon as we can get it ready. In the meantime, you can also follow us, or email us rather, at info@sportchangealliance.com. And that is all from me. So thank you very much again. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye from all of us. Bye-bye.